In a day where immortality and beauty shone with intensity, the gods gathered to celebrate a wedding that promised to be memorable, the union of Peleo, a mortal, and Thetis, a marine goddess. Everything shone in gold and marble, and the aromas of nectar and ambrosia filled the air. But among the perfection of the banquet, a shadow waited, silent but devastating. Not all guests were welcome. Eris, the goddess of discord, had not received an invitation. His name caused tension. It was known for sowing chaos where harmony reigned, for transforming celebrations into eternal conflicts. Wounded in his pride, he reached the banquet with a gift in his hands, a golden apple that shone with a disturbing light. On it, recorded with cruel precision, the words were, "For the most beautiful." At that moment, the atmosphere froze. Each goddess felt how the apple seemed to call them, claiming their attention. Hera, Zeus's powerful wife, took her as a personal challenge. Athena, the invincible strategist, was not going to allow someone eclipse her. Aphrodite, the incarnation of beauty itself, smiled with an air of certainty. Among looks full of pride and rivalry, Zeus intervened, aware that any decision would trigger a storm impossible to stop. It was then that the responsibility fell to a young Trojan prince named Paris. Far from the divine banquets, this shepherd took care of his flocks in the first leg. His noble origin was marked by the pain of a dark destiny. Abandoned at birth, he had survived against all probability. But now, fate called him again, and this time, the price would be much higher. 3 goddesses appeared before him, each carrying not only his pride but also an offer that would change the course of humanity. Hera, with his imposing voice, promised power and dominion over countless kingdoms. Athena, with his firm gaze, offered wisdom and victory in all battles. But it was Aphrodite who took a step forward, wrapping the moment in a disturbing silence. His promise was simple, but devastating, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris's heart staggered. He was not a warrior, nor an ambitious king. He was a young man with human dreams and desires, someone who knew loneliness and yearned for a love that transcended everything. The choice became evident in his mind, although his soul sensed the weight that would bring. With the apple in his hands, Paris delivered it to Aphrodite. At that moment, the air seemed to break, as if the same earth knew that something irreversible had just happened. Hera and Athena departed, wounded in her pride, but her silence was a threat that Paris failed to understand in all her magnitude. While Aphrodite smiled, Helena's name was already echoing in her mind. Hundreds of kilometers, in Sparta, that woman of an almost divine beauty lived her life outside the chaos that would soon reach her. But the gods never act without consequences. Hera and Athena, humiliated, began to warn plans that would not only affect Paris, but to every Trojan. The seed of the war had been planted, and although no one could stop it, the flames of the destruction were already raised on the horizon. Paris returned to the first leg, carrying the weight of his decision. In his mind, Aphrodite's face guided him, but in his heart, something dark and cold began to grow. Divine promises are never gifts, they are traps disguised as dreams. And in Troy, where life followed its course under the high and proud walls, the city slept, unconscious that one day its glory would be raised by a choice that seemed as insignificant as a golden apple. The wind blew when Paris set foot in Sparta. The waters had been benevolent during their journey, and Aphrodite, faithful to their promise, seemed to guide each of its steps. However, under the apparent calm of that day, something invisible and dark vibrated in the air, as if the gods themselves contained their breath, attentive to what was about to happen. In the Palacio de Menelao, king of Sparta, luxury could not hide the severe character of a man accustomed to war. But it was when Paris saw her for the first time that everything else vanished. There was Helena, the woman whose fame crossed kingdoms and seas, whose beauty was not only a gift, but a conviction. His presence was overwhelming, as if the light itself bowed towards it. His deep and hypnotizing eyes met those from Paris for a moment that seemed eternal. At that moment, he knew, there was no going back. Helena was Menelaus's wife, but at the bottom of her gaze there was a flash of melancholy, a spark of dissatisfaction that Paris, guided by Aphrodite, knew how to interpret. On the days that followed, the young Trojan displayed an almost supernatural charm, cultivated not only by its youth and attractiveness, but for the burning conviction that consumed it. Each word, each gesture, seemed woven with the same magic that had sealed the promise of the goddess. Menelaus departed unexpectedly, convened by state affairs. It was then that Paris and Helena were alone, and the barriers that separate them began to crumble. The attraction between them was like a storm, uncontrollable, inevitable. Paris spoke of Troy, his landscapes bathed in the sun, of the walls that seemed to touch the sky. Helena listened, and in her words she found an invitation to escape the routine that imprisoned her. One night, while the palace slept, Helena made a decision that would change the fate of two worlds. In silence, he picked up a few belongings and met with Paris in the port, where a ship waited under the moon. The oars broke the water gently, and Sparta faded in the distance, while Helena felt a mixture of fear and emotion, a vertigo that was born from the abyss she was thrown. When the boat reached Troy, the city received them with amazement and celebrations. Helena, dazzling and alien to the whispers of the Trojans, walked next to Paris as if the fate had led her there. However, not all faces were of joy. Hector, Paris's older brother, watched the scene with a concern he could not hide. He, more than anyone, understood the laws of the gods and men. What seemed like a triumph soon brought blood and fire. In Sparta, the news came like a thunder. Menelaus, furious and humiliated, summoned the kings of Greece. Among them, his brother Agamemnon, whose power and ambition burned with an intensity that rivaled the same Olympic flame. That affront was not only personal, it was a wound to the honor of all Greece, and the answer would be devastating. But while the armies began to meet, Paris and Helena lived in a bubble of love and enthusiasm. They walked together through the gardens of the royal palace, surrounded by roses and fountains. Paris looked at her as if she were a miracle, and Helena, for the first time in years, felt something similar to freedom. However, at the bottom of their hearts, both knew that the moment was fragile, that time advanced like a river that could not stop. The flames of the passion that joined them soon would be intertwined with the flames of a war that would consume everything in their path. And in Troy, among the stones of their high walls, the echo of the swords was already beginning to resonate. Menelaus' roar broke the air like a thunder that announced a storm. The throne room, dark and solemn, trembled under the weight of his fury. His face, ignition of anger, was a mask of pain and humiliation. The king of Sparta, known for his controlled temperament, now walked from one place to another, like a caged lion, unable to contain the hotbed that consumed him. His wife, his Helena, had been torn from her side, carried as a trophy by a foreign prince. The grievance was more than personal, it was a wound that stained his honor and that of all Greece. When the messengers confirmed that Helena and Paris had arrived in Troy, Menelaus released a shout that resonated on the walls of the palace. Not only had his wife lost, but his pride had been trampled in front of the world. But he was not a man who accepted defeat. In his eyes, the rage was not only of a betrayed husband, but of a king who understood that respect defended himself with blood. It was then that he sent a message to Mycenae, to the powerful Agamemnon, his older brother. The relationship between them had not always been easy. Agamemnon was an ambitious man, accustomed to his word being law, but shared an unwavering bond, family loyalty, and the desire to protect the honor of the Atrides. When Agamemnon read Menelaus' letter, an icy smile appeared on his lips. The affront against her brother was an opportunity. Not only was it avenged to Helena, but to unite all Greece under his command, to turn his name into a legend that the bards would sing for centuries. In Sparta, Menelaus expected the arrival of the other kings, his heart a whirlwind of emotions. A part of him remembered the nights on which Helena sat next to her, her soft laugh filling the living room. But those memories only fed their fury. It wasn't just a woman what she had lost, it was the symbol of his power, respect for his people. And that, he swore, would not be unpunished. Little by little, the great names of Greece began to arrive. Ulysses, the king of Ithaca, famous for his ingenuity, tried to avoid war with cunning excuses, but finally joined the call. Ajax, huge and powerful as a bull, arrived with his shining armor. Diames, the fierce warrior, offered his sword without hesitation. Even Achilles, the young hero of the Myrmidons, was summoned, although his participation would depend on convincing him that fate called him. At the center of everything, Agamemnon orchestrated preparations with cold precision. The ships aligned in the ports, the weapons shone under the sun, and the men sang war songs, ready to sail towards Troy. But in Agamemnon's words, there was a warning for all: this was not just the Menelaus war. This was a crusade for the honor of Greece, a cause that justified any sacrifice. Meanwhile, on the walls of Sparta, Menelaus looked at the horizon, his mind trapped between the desire to recover Helena and the need to destroy Paris. In his chest, anger and love struggled like two wild beasts, and every second that passed fed his determination. Paris had not only stolen his wife, he had stolen his world, and Menelaus would not rest until Troy paid with blood for that betrayal. The roar of the armies could already be heard in the hills. The drums marked the rhythm of a war that none of them could imagine. Helena, the cause of everything, remained in Troy, outside the chaos that her beauty had unleashed. And Paris, with her love for her as her only justification, walked under the high walls of her city, without knowing that a sea of ships would soon rise on the horizon, bringing with him the fury of Greece. The Greek camp in Iliad was mired in a disturbing silence. The ships, aligned as a sleeping legion, remained motionless in the calm waters, trapped by a strange stillness that seemed to come from the same gods. Agamemnon, frustrated and full of impatience, walked from one place to another, his dark look fixed on the horizon. The troops were ready, the eager men to leave for Troy, but the winds refused to blow. Something or someone retained them, and uncertainty began to corrode the spirit of the warriors. It was then that Calchas, the fortune teller, asked for the attention of the Greek high command. His thin and aged figure contrasted with the robust bodies of the warriors that surrounded him, but his words had the weight of an oracle. In the circle of commanders, his voice echoed with a gravity that made it tremble to the bravest. "Artemis is furious," he said, his eyes shining with painful knowledge. "The goddess demands a sacrifice. Without her favor, winds will remain calm, and our ships will never sail towards Troy." The words left everyone out of breath, but the worst was yet to come. Calchas continued, his voice trembling when he pronounced the sentence, "It must be Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon. Only her blood will appease the anger of the goddess." Agamemnon's face frozen in a mixture of disbelief and horror. Iphigenia, his daughter, his purest light, had to be delivered to the altar. It was an unbearable price, but the war depended on it. If he did not fulfill the fate, not only Troy would remain intact, but his leadership would be questioned. The responsibility of the army, the promise to his brother Menelaus, and the pressure of the other kings placed him in front of an impossible decision. That night, Agamemnon wrote a letter. His words were impregnated with deception and pain. He summoned Iphigenia and his mother Clytemnestra to the camp, under the pretext that the young woman should marry Achilles. It was a calculated lie, a way to attract them without raising suspicions. His hands trembled as he sealed the letter, but his mind was trapped between duty and love. When Iphigenia reached Iliad, the atmosphere was strange, loaded with a tension that could not understand. Clytemnestra, excited by the supposed wedding, looked at his daughter with pride, not knowing that Agamemnon's words hid an abyss of betrayal. The young woman, with her golden hair and her innocent smile, illuminated the camp with her presence, ignoring the gloomy looks of the warriors who knew her destiny. When the truth came to light, the cry of Clytemnestra resonated as a lament that pierced the sky. The mother, enraged and desperate, faced Agamemnon with a fury that few men could endure. But Agamemnon, broken inside, remained firm. His voice, empty and monotonous, repeated the words of Calchas, "It is the will of the gods." Iphigenia, at first, cried disconsolate, trapped in a terror that no human being should experience. But over time, something changed in his gaze. He understood the weight of what was at stake. His sacrifice was not just to calm a goddess, it was to guarantee the departure of thousands of men, to fulfill a destination that seemed inevitable. With a serenity that torn the heart of everyone present, he accepted his destiny. "If my death will allow Greece to triumph, then whatever it is," he said in a firm voice that contrasted with his youth. On the day of the sacrifice, the camp met in a sepulchral silence. The altar was decorated with flowers, a cruel contrast to the tragedy that would be carried out. Agamemnon, pale and with a lost look, observed how his daughter walked towards her death with the dignity of a queen. Iphigenia did not cry, it was the army who cried for her. Even Achilles, deeply moved by the young woman's courage, tried to stop the sacrifice, but was in vain. When the knife descended, a strong and sudden wind rose, shaking the sails of the ships and carrying with them the aroma of the sea. Artemisa had accepted the sacrifice, and the Greeks could finally leave for Troy. But in the heart of Agamemnon, a dark and eternal vacuum settled. He had lost his daughter, and although the winds would take them to glory, the price would be remembered as an indelible stain in their soul. While the ships were preparing to sail, Clytemnestra watched in silence, his face hardened by pain and hate. Inside, a promise began to form, a promise that would seal Agamemnon's fate when he returned from Troy. The waters of the Aegean, which had been a quiet mirror for days, began to stir with the roar of the oars and the blow of the waves against the helmets of the Greek ships. An endless armed, with white candles that shone under the sun, advanced to the coast of Troy. The breeze, finally favorable thanks to the sacrifice of Iphigenia, carried the echo of the war chants. Thousands of warriors looked at the horizon, where the high and proud walls of Troy raised themselves as a silent challenge. It was the beginning of a war that would mark the story. When the first ship line reached the beach, the chaos unleashed. The vessels collided with the sand, and the soldiers jumped into the water, some with swords already drawn, others with high shields, ready to face the enemy. Paris, watching from the walls with his brothers Hector and Deiphobo, felt a chill when he saw the immensity of the Greek troops. Despite his apparent courage, the magnitude of the threat was undeniable. Hector, always the strategist, ordered his troops to form a defensive line in the nearby hills. The Trojans, led by their brave warriors, descended with shouts of war, colliding with the Greeks in an explosion of violence. Lances crossed the air as lightning, swords met with meat and metal, and the sound of the screams and the steel filled the battlefield. Achilles, at the head of the Myrmidons, was the first to highlight. His armor shone as if the sun himself had chosen him as his champion. With every blow of his spear, a Trojan fell, and his fury seemed unstoppable. It was a force of nature, a god on earth, and the Trojans began to retreat under their onslaught. But the resistance of the Trojans was no less impressive. Hector, mounted in his car, led his men with a calm that inspired as much as it terrified. His spear found his goal with mortal precision, and his presence maintained the morale of his high troops, even when the Greeks advanced with ferocity. While the battle burned on the beach, Menelao, with his face hardened by rage, looked for Paris among chaos. His desire for revenge was a fire that consumed him, but the Trojan prince, knowing that facing him would mean a safe death, remained at a distance, protected by his men. Amid the confusion, Odysseus demonstrated his cunning. Observing the land and the arrangement of the Trojan troops, he guided a group of warriors to a vulnerable flank. His maneuver allowed the Greeks to gain ground, pushing the defenders closer to the doors of Troy. As the sun descended, staining the sky red, the battle began to decrease. The Greeks had secured the beach, but not without paying a high price. The bodies of friends and enemies lay scattered, and the sand was dyed with blood. From the walls, the Trojans watched with bleak faces, aware that this was only the first of many battles. That night, the Greeks lit bonfires on the beach. The flames illuminated the tired faces and fresh wounds of the men who, despite tiredness, kept the determination alive. In their hearts, the promise of glory and revenge was still burning. In Troy, the atmosphere was also tense. Citizens looked from the streets and squares to the walls, where their heroes argued strategies and evaluated losses. Hector, always the pillar of his people, walked among his men, offering them words of encouragement. Paris, on the other hand, avoided the accusing looks of those who questioned their role in the tragedy that had fallen over their city. The war had begun, and both sides knew that there would be no truce until one fell. The coast of Troy, now witnesses of blood and steel, would be the scene of a fight that will resonate in time, a war that would challenge not only men, but also to the gods themselves. In a cave hidden between the mountains of the Pelion, where the winds whispered with ancient secrets and the trees bowed as silent guardians, Achilles' legend was born. He was an extraordinary child, son of Thetis, the goddess of the sea, and Pelio, a mortal of noble blood. From the moment he opened his eyes to the world, his destiny was marked, intertwined with glory and tragedy, as if the threads of his life had been woven by the same Moira. Thetis, knowing that his son was not a simple mortal, he sought to protect him from any damage. One night, under the silver light of the moon, he submerged him in the waters of the Stygia river, whose currents granted invulnerability to those who touched them. However, when holding it on the heel, he left a small part of his exposed body, a fragile point that fate would soon claim. Achilles grew surrounded by his mother's love and his father's respect, but his true home was far from the palace. When he was still young, he was sent to the Pelion, where Centaur Chiron, the wisest of the teachers, became his mentor. In the solitude of the mountains, far from the noise of men, Achilles learned to listen to the land of the earth, to understand the language of the stars, and to forge their body and spirit for the challenges that expected it. Chiron was not just a formidable warrior, it was a philosopher, a healer, a being whose wisdom transcended time. Under his tutelage, Achilles not only learned to handle the sword and spear, but also to heal wounds, to distinguish herbs that could save a life or finish it, and to reflect on the dilemmas he would face as leader and warrior. It was a training that not only molded his strength, but also his soul. But Thetis's blood boiled in his veins, and the young Achilles soon showed that his skill even exceeded the highest expectations. His speed was unmatched, the men said it could run faster than the wind. His strength seemed to challenge human limits, and his courage was a fire that could not be off. However, in his eye somewhat deeper shone a shadow, a feeling that his life, however great, would be marked by a flame that would burn intensely, but for a short time. One day, while practicing with Chiron under a sky loaded with clouds, the centaur stopped and looked at him with an unusual seriousness. "You are great, Achilles, perhaps the greatest of all men. But even the strongest cannot escape his destiny." Chiron told him then about the war that was coming, of the glory that awaited him, but also of the short duration of his life. Achilles listened silently, and although his words left a weight on his chest, he was not afraid. He knew that greatness required sacrifice, and was willing to pay the price. Over time, his fame grew as a storm that advances without being arrested. The men talked about him with admiration and fear. He was more than a warrior, it was a symbol of strength and courage that they even challenged the gods. But in his heart, Achilles was still the child who had run free through the mountains, the apprentice who had heard the advice of a Sabio centaur, and the son who longed to see his mother smile once more. Thetis, always vigilant, tried to protect him from the coming war. He hid it in the court of Lycomedes, disguised as a woman, among the king's daughters. There, under the name of Pyrrha, Achilles briefly lived away from the edge of the swords. But his spirit was too great to remain hidden. When Odysseus arrived looking for the hero aimed at leading the Greeks, Achilles could not resist the call of glory. Odysseus's trick, showing weapons with jewels to identify the hidden warrior, was enough to reveal his true identity. With his glowing armor and his spear in hand, Achilles joined the Greek army. His mother, resigned to his destiny, handed him weapons forged by Hephaestus, the god of fire, a shield that narrated stories of the world, and an armor that shone like gold under the sun. Before leaving, Thetis looked at him for the last time, his eyes full of love and sadness. "Remember, my son, your name will be eternal, but your life will be brief." When Achilles approached the ship that would take him to Troy, he didn't look back. He knew that his destiny was waiting for him in the sands of that distant land, where his courage would be proven and his immortalized name. In his heart, the promise of glory burned with an intensity that eclipsed any fear. And so, the son of Thetis became the warrior who would change the course of war and the destiny of men. From the high walls of Troy, Hector contemplated the horizon with a serene but firm look. It was an imposing figure, not only for its shining armor, but because of the calm and courage that radiated. For the citizens of Troy, Hector was not just a prince, it was their hope, the shield that protected them from the storm that hidden over them. In the distance, the Greek camps burned with the brightness of thousands of bonfires, and the echo of their war songs filled the night. The battle was inevitable, and Hector knew it better than anyone. Son of Priam and Hecuba, Hector had been raised not only as guerrero, but as a leader. From a young age, he had understood that his life did not belong to him completely, he was linked to his people, the walls of Troy, and the lives that depended on his strength and wisdom. His training was rigorous, his sharp mind as his sword, but what distinguished him was not only his ability on the battlefield, but his deep sense of duty and unwavering love for his family. In the palace, Hector was a different man. With his wife Andromache and his son Astyanact, his hardness faded. He was a tender husband and a devout father who found in everyday moments with them a comfort for the weight he carried on his shoulders. Often, he knelt to raise his son in his arms, promising him a better future, one in which Troy would be safe. "When you grow up, Troy will be stronger, and you will not know fear," he said, although deep down he knew that this promise was uncertain. Andromache, on the other hand, was her rock, a strong woman who understood him better than anyone. Although his heart was full of Hector's security, he never showed weakness in front of him. At night, while the prince rested briefly, she watched over her peace, hiding her tears so as not to add more weight to her load. Together they formed an unwavering link, a union that gave them strength to face adversity. On the battlefield, Hector was relentless. He fought with the fury of a man who knew that every victory was another step towards the salvation of his home. But even in the heat of the struggle, he never lost his humanity. He was not a man guided by hate, but for the need to protect. Every time he lifted his spear, he did not for thirst for blood, but for love, to his people, to his family, to the city that was the soul of its existence. But Hector was also human, and like all men, he faced doubts. Sometimes, he wondered if the gods really were on their side, if the sacrifice of so many was worth it. In those moments of vulnerability, he found comfort in his mother's words, Hecuba, who reminded him that his lineage carried the blessing of the gods, and in the wisdom of his father, Priam, whose unwavering faith in him was a lighthouse in the darkness. However, Hector was not naive. He knew that the arrival of Achilles on the battlefield represented a danger that even him, the best warrior of Troy, could not ignore. He had heard the stories of Thetis' son, a man whose fury in war was compared to that of Ars, the god of war. But instead of being carried away by fear, Hector accepted his role with a dignity that only true heroes possess. "If Troy falls," I thought, "let it be with honor. If I have to die, be fighting for what I love." The day before facing Achilles, Hector walked through the streets of Troy. The citizens watched him with admiration, and although he responded with smiles and words of encouragement, in his heart he knew that it could be the last time he saw those family faces. He climbed to the walls and looked towards the Greek camp, where the weapons shone under the sun. The war was at its peak, and fate would soon call it. That night, at the palace, time with his family spent. Andromache, feeling the weight of the inevitable, begged him not to leave the battlefield the next day. "Hector, you are the life of this city, the fortress that keeps Troy standing. If I lose you, I will lose everything," he said, his voice broken by despair. Hector hugged her, feeling how her own heart torn. "If I don't fight, Andromache, who will? I can't escape what I am." By holding his son for the last time, Hector felt a stab of sadness and pride. He knew that his legacy would live in him, that his sacrifice would not be in vain. "Astyanact," he whispered, "that the gods guide you. If I am not, that you grow up with the strength of your mother and the love of this people." When the morning arrived, Hector went to the battlefield with his head high. His steps were firm, his determined look. Troy watched him, his heart beating in unison with each movement of the prince. He was more than a man, it was the soul of his city, the guardian of his hopes and dreams. Under the stormy sky of Ithaca, a man watched the sea with a look containing the weight of 1,000 thoughts. Ulysses, known by the Greeks as Odysseus, was not like the other heroes. While others trusted the strength of their arms or at the speed of his feet, he depended on something more powerful, his mind. He was a man who understood that war does not always win with the sword, but with the strategy, and that cunning could be a more deadly weapon than steel. From a young age, Ulysses had demonstrated an intelligence that separated him from others. While his companions marveled with weapons and fighting, he was lost in the labyrinths of words, enigmas, and challenges that require ingenuity. His father, Let's, had recognized that unique brightness in his son's eyes and encouraged him to develop it. For Ulysses, each problem was an opportunity, each obstacle a challenge that could be overcome with the acute mind and rapid ingenuity. In the heart of his cunning there was a unique ability to read people. Ulysses not only understood human emotions, manipulated them with precision that was almost disturbing. I knew when to use the right word, when to sow doubt, and when to inspire trust. That ability not only did an exceptional leader, but also a relentless strategist, capable of seeing the plays that others could not even imagine. However, its cunning was not cold or calculating in its entirety. Ulysses had a deep sense of responsibility for their people and their family. His love for his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, was the engine that promoted many of his decisions. Everything he did, even the most risky or questionable, was destined to protect them and ensure their future. For him, cunning was not only a means to win, but a way of surviving in a world ruled by force and brutality. The fame of Ulysses as the Cunning was consolidated with an act that would change the course of the Trojan War, the oath of Helena's suitors. Before the conflict was unleashed, it was Ulysses who suggested that all Greek kings and princes swear protect the chosen as Helena's husband, regardless of whoever. At that time, no one could foresee the consequences of that pact, but when Paris kidnapped Helena, Ulysses was one of the first to remind them of his oath. It was a calculated movement, a coup of ingenuity that united the Greek factions under a common goal. Despite his initial reticence to join war, after everything, who would leave his home and family for a conflict that did not belong to him? Ulysses soon proved his worth on the battlefield and in strategic meetings. He was a man who knew when to attack and when to retire, when to speak and when to remain silent. While other heroes like Achilles and Menelaus shone by strength, Ulysses stood out for their meticulously elaborate plans, for their ability to anticipate what no one could. It was he who devised the plan to take Achilles at the head of battle, hidden among the daughters of King Lycomedes. It was he who negotiated with Greek leaders to resolve internal conflicts that threatened to destroy the alliance. And, of course, it would be he who would later design the ruling that would ensure the victory of the Greeks, the Trojan horse. However, not everything in Ulysses was calculation and strategy. There was an inner fire in him, a passion that sometimes made him risk beyond reason. His cunning was a double-edged sword, which could save or destroy it depending on how he handled it. More than once, his confidence in his own ingenuity led him to underestimate his enemies or to face challenges that would have bent to any other man. In the war council, Ulysses was always in the center, with his eyes attentive, listening, observing, evaluating. His companions often looked at him with a mixture of respect and suspicion, aware that after his quiet smile there was always a mind working, always calculating. Even Agamemnon, the powerful leader of the expedition, knew that he would need Ulysses if he wanted to have any hope of conquering Troy. But Ulysses's cunning was not just for war, it was also his shield in personal tragedies. When the sacrifices seemed too great, when the shadows of the loss and doubt hovered about him, he found comfort in the idea that his mind could overcome any adversity. His cunning was not only his tool for victory, but also his anchor in a chaotic world. While the Greeks prepared to besiege Troy, Ulysses remained silent, his eyes looking at the city walls. For him, it was not just one more battle, it was a chessboard in which each piece had to move precisely. I knew that brute force would not be enough to tear down Troy. What would be needed was a plan that challenged imagination, a strategy that would be recorded in everyone's memory. With every step he took, Ulysses wove his cunning network, always one step ahead, always vigilant. It was more than a hero, it was a British English that understood the nature of war and humanity itself. And although he knew that his way would be full of challenges, he was prepared to face them with the most powerful tool he possessed, his mind. The warm afternoon breeze felt heavy in the Greek camp, where the heroes gathered, observing the elongated shadows of their banners and weapons. Among the figures that emerged as legends in the Trojan War, there were names that shone with a fierce brightness, but not everything was greatness and glory. In each of those warriors a story of sacrifice, courage, and endless struggle slept. Among them, Ajax and Diomed stood out not only for their battle skill, but for their unwavering character. Ajax the Great, a man-giant, was known by his colossal force and his indomitable courage. His presence on the battlefield was like an earthquake. There were no strong enough walls or armies that could stop their progress. He was the most faithful defender of his people, and his shield, huge and almost as great as he was his main weapon, an extension of his own being. He fought with such ferocity that even the Trojans feared hearing their name. However, after his great courage, a figure marked by despair was hidden. Ajax was not just a man of war, he was also a man of honor. During one of the darkest moments of the war, when Achilles retired from the fight due to his anger, fate played one of his cruelest letters. The Greeks, without Achilles, lost ground to the Trojans. In the midst of chaos, the Greek navy called for advice to decide who would take Achilles' weapons, the prize he had left behind. The election fell to Odysseus, who, with his usual cunning, had convinced everyone that it was he who deserved arms. For Ajax, that moment was a deadly blow to his honor. Consumed by anger and shame, he retired in the dark, sunk in revenge thoughts. He did not understand how his worth on the battlefield, his constant sacrifice, had not been enough to gain the recognition he felt he deserved. That night, lost in his fury, Ajax was the victim of a terrible illusion sent by Athena, goddess of wisdom. The goddess, seeing the danger of her overflowing rage, made Ajax see Trojan enemies as simple sheep. In his delirium, he began to massacre the Greek soldiers, confused with the Trojans. Upon awakening, reality hit him strongly, and the weight of his action was too much for his honor. Not being able to endure humiliation, Ajax decided to end his life, going through his own sword. Ajax's tragedy became a painful reminder of the limits of human fury and the loss of honor in a world without justice. But next to Ajax, the battlefield also resonated with the exploits of other heroes, such as Diomedes, the intrepid leader of the Argivos. Of more light complexion than Ajax, but equally formidable, Diomedes stood out for his courage and his ability to adapt to circumstances. Unlike many other warriors, Diomedes not only depended on his physical strength, but on his acute intelligence and his ability to make quick decisions in the midst of chaos. One of Diomedes' most memorable stories occurred when, despite the threat of the gods themselves, he dared to face with God Ars. While the god of war fought on the battlefield, Diomedes, without fear, attacked him with his spear. Wounded by the aggression of a mortal, Ars retired, defeated by the cunning and courage of man. This act, considered almost suicidal, consolidated Diomedes as one of the boldest and respected warriors of the war. However, like all heroes, Diomedes also faced their own dilemmas. Although his heart was beating for his people and his homeland, war was not a scenario of immaculate glory. Inside, he constantly fought with the consequences of his actions, the weight of violence and the deaths he left in his path. He was not a man of simple victories, but a man marked by the scars of the conflict. Next to them, there were other warriors whose courage was no less notable. Idomeneo, the king of Crete, fought with the cunning of an old fox and the skill of a young warrior. Nestor, the elder wise, whose wisdom was guided the youngest, always found a way of maintaining the morale of the high army, even in the darkest moments. And, of course, there was the unwavering sponsorship, the closest friend of Achilles, whose loyalty to the Greek hero was as deep as the ocean. But even among these heroes, there was a common thread: the shadow of death was always present. In the war, the glory was intertwined with the tragedy, and there was no certainty of an unhurdled victory. While Ajax fell by his own honor, Diomedes continued to fight with the mind and body, not forgetting the lessons that the war taught him. Each of these warriors, with their own stories of courage, sacrifice, and suffering, represented what the Trojan War had done with men. It didn't matter how big the hero was, all were puppets of a destiny that even the gods could completely control. In their battles, they not only fought for Troy or Greece, but for something much deeper, their own sense of humanity. The air was impregnated with tension, and the sound of the swords colliding and the cries of the combatants resonated over the hills and valleys that surrounded Troy. The war seemed to overflow its borders, extending not only on Earth, but also on Olympus, the kingdom of the gods. In that scenario, mortals were not the only ones fighting. The gods, with their power and pride, were also deeply involved in the conflict, moving the threads of destiny as if it were a simple chess game. Zeus, the king of the gods, watched everything from the top of Mount Olympus. In his eyes a mixture of sadness and power shone. He knew that the Trojan War, although initiated by human causes, could not be alien to his will. Although he was the most powerful of the gods, Zeus tried to stay neutral, although his own heart was dragged by the fight. He was a father of all the gods and mortals, and as such, his love for his people kept him in an awkward position. He wanted humans to solve their own conflicts, but realized that he could not avoid intervening. Each of the gods had their own interests in the conflict. While Zeus tried to maintain balance, others of his brothers and sisters did not share their desire for impartiality. Hera, his wife, could not bear the idea that Troy, the city defended by her enemy, the goddess Aphrodite, prevailed. Hera, jealous and vindictive, saw in the war an opportunity to impose his will and make sure the Greeks prevail. With a fierce determination, he had decided that victory should be his, that Troy should fall. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, also joined the conflict, but her motivation was something different. Although he had an affinity for the Greeks, his interest was not simply to see Troy fall, but to demonstrate that cunning and intelligence were more powerful than mere brute strength. Athena saw in Ulysses a reflection of his own nature and favored him, guiding his decisions with wisdom and giving him advantage over the Trojans in key moments. His power was not only in physical force, but in tactical decisions, those that changed the course of war without mortal even suspecting that they were being guided by invisible hands. But while Zeus, Hera, and Athena were the most prominent figures, Olympus was full of other gods whose passions and desires also influenced the destiny of mortals. Apollo, the god of the sun and the arrow, bowed in favor of the Trojans. His love for Prince Hector promoted him to intervene in the war to protect him. Every time the Trojans seemed to be losing, Apollo threw their arrow with deadly precision, knocking down the Greek warriors with a skill that humans could not even understand. He was a god who not only fought strongly, but with a deep desire to protect what he loved, even if it meant challenging the will of other gods. On the other hand, Artemisa, Apollo's twin sister, also took sides, but she fought more for the ideals of nature and purity. While his brother sought the conflict, Artemis struggled to maintain war in balance, reminding mortals of the consequences of violence and destruction. In his interventions, he tried to restore a certain order among the tormented souls of the warriors. But Troy's war was also a battlefield for the minor gods, those who moved in the shadows, pushed by jealousy, desires, or revenge. They were the gods who only intervened in moments of weakness, those who did not possess the power of the great Olympics, but whose influence could make a difference. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, was one of those gods. Although its nature was that of a pacifier, it could not avoid being part of the turns of destiny. With its cunning and its speed, it intervened in decisive moments, delivering messages or protecting those who were on their way. The struggle of the gods also extended to the hearts of the heroes. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, was invulnerable except in a single point, his heel. It was his mother, Thetis, goddess of the sea, who protected him and prepared him for war. But while Achilles immersed himself in battle with his fury, El God guided him in complex ways. Athena protected him and inspired him, but it was also Apollo who found chances to tear him down. And when Achilles fell into despair for the death of his friend Patroclo, it was the love of the gods that pushed him back to the fight. In Troy, the Trojans were also driven by the divine hands. Hector, the noble Trojan prince, was under the protection of Apollo, but as the war progressed, the gods seemed to move away, leaving mortals face their destiny without the same guide. The intervention of the gods became an erratic dance, a strip and loosen that dictated the fate of the combatants. Trojan's war was not just a conflict between humans, it was a will and power struggle, in which the gods played in their own way, moving the heroes as pieces on a divine chessboard. His interventions, his passions, his thirst for revenge and love, everything was intertwined in a destination that they could not completely control. In the end, humans not only fought among them, but with the whims of the gods, who sometimes granted victory and other times they snatched it without compassion. The first shadows of the war hovered on Troy as an omen, and the clay of war drums resonated throughout the horizon. The winds of the contest blow strongly, driving the Greek troops to the Trojan coast. The peace that had reigned for years crumbled under the weight of spears and swords. The first siege of Troy was not just a series of battles, it was a confrontation of wills, cunning, honor, and despair, where each movement counted, and the lives of thousands of warriors hung from a thread. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, had reached the coast of Troy with a fury that only a deeper grievance as Helena's rapture could have fed. But upon arrival, they found a much greater challenge than they had anticipated. Troy walls were imposing, high and strong as a mountain, and the Trojans, under Hector's leadership, were fiercely determined to protect their city. The first shock was not only physical, but also psychological. The Greeks were few compared to the Trojans, but what they needed in number compensated it with a fierce determination. From the beginning, the Greeks had to face distrust and lack of unity among their own leaders. Agamemnon, despite being the supreme commander, failed to maintain control over all Greek generals. However, the great heroes such as Achilles, Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax joined him, with only one objective: take Troy. Honor, revenge, and glory united them, but, at first, something more important motivated them: the fate of Helen and everything he represented. Throughout the first days of siege, the Greeks began to surround Troy, trying to fence the city. But the Trojans, determined not to give in, responded with a fierce resistance. Hector, the prince of Troy, led his own. He was a man of honor, an unparalleled warrior on the battlefield, and his love for his city and his family promoted him to give everything to keep his own. While the arrows rained on the walls, Hector organized the defensive lines with impressive precision, always looking for the opportunity to hit hard when the Greeks made a mistake. The first battles were a mixture of victories and losses for both sides. The Greeks, despite their strength and determination, suffered significant losses, especially in face-to-face clashes with the strongest warriors of Troy. The city walls were almost impossible to penetrate, and the Trojans, with their knowledge of the land and their strengths, managed to repel attacks again and again. Greek troops began to feel the weight of frustration, while Trojan resistance seemed unwavering. However, despite the setbacks, the Greeks did not give up. At a start of despair, Agamemnon began to devise new strategies, looking for gaps in Trojan defenses. It was then that the most cunning among them, like Ulysses, began to analyze the situation from a different perspective. They knew that brute force would not be enough to beat Troy. The siege would require something else, something that only the minds of the most cunning could conceive. The first incursions were mainly attempts to break the walls, with the Greeks using large war machines such as catapults and ram. However, the Trojans, alerted by the gods and their own ingenuity, knew how to defend themselves from these attacks. The Greeks, on the other hand, tried something new every day: a new strategy, a new siege machine, a new attempt to do bleager to the Trojans. But time seemed to be from the defenders. While the Greeks continued to suffer casualties, the Trojan forces not only resisted, but also hit when they least expected it. Hector, in particular, played a crucial role in each confrontation. With his skill and courage, it made the difference in each battle, challenging the greatest Greek heroes in fighting that left a mark on all those present. In one of the most epic encounters, he challenged Ajax, the imposing Greek warrior, to a duel that became a show of strength and honor. Although the fight ended in a draw, the glory of both warriors consolidated, and the determination of the Trojans grew even more. However, what many did not know was that, while the physical battles continued, the true siege was occurring in the minds of the leaders of both sides. The gods, as always, played a crucial role in the destiny of mortals. Athena and Hera, supporting the Greeks, guided their strategies with cunning, while Apollo and Artemis, faithful to the Trojans, granted them divine protection. In the midst of violence, the will of the gods became felt, and divine interventions turned out to be as decisive as the heroes' swords. As the days passed, the war took a darker turn. The first days of siege, in which the Greeks fought with determination, gave way to a more bloody and desperate war. The dead accumulated on the banks of the Calandro River, and the stench of death began to wrap both the Greeks and the Trojans. The glory of the battles was tarnished by pain and loss. The heroes, with each victory, approached their tragic destiny, while the gods watched from the heights, deciding the course of war, unable to ignore human suffering. The first siege of Troy was only the beginning of a conflict that would destroy the lives of thousands, but would also forge the legends that would be counted for centuries. Both sides, moved by his pride, his pain, and his dreams of victory, were condemned to face again and again, while the future of Troy and Greece hung from a thread. The sun began to descend, staining the sky of a bloody red, as if the same nature presages what was about to happen. The earth, still impregnated with sweat and the blood of the warriors, seemed to be suspended. In the Greek camp, the traces of the previous battles left a trail of suffering and tension. But that day was not like the others. The wind blew, carrying a whisper that spoke of an inevitable destiny. Menelaus, the king of Sparta, approached with a firm step, his bright armor under the sun, his look fixed on the horizon. Faced with him, at a distance, he was Paris, Prince Trojan, accompanied by his brother Hector, who watched him with a mixture of hope and concern. The cause of this duel was not only the revenge of a betrayed king, but the weight of a love and an offense that had triggered the most brutal war in history. Menelaus, furious for the loss of Helena, the woman who had loved and who had been torn from her side by Paris' cunning, had demanded revenge. And Paris, the young Trojan prince, knowing that his life hung from a thread, had accepted the challenge, with the arrogance that only the gods or youth can grant. That was not just a duel between two men, it was a battle in which Miles's fate was at stake. The ground trembled with the weight of the warriors that were aligned on both sides. The Greeks, with their eyes full of rage, watched their king move towards the battlefield. The Trojans, equally tense, did not stop praying to the gods, because they knew that the future of their city depended on the courage of their prince. The echoes of the war seemed to fade in that precise moment, as if everything was suspended, waiting for the clash of those two men, destined to decide the future of the struggle. Menelaus and Paris looked at each other, their eyes reflecting the fury of years of suffering. They were not just two men facing, there were two worlds that collided, two stories that were intertwined in a single moment. Menelaus, veteran in the war, with the experience written in each line of his face, was not as young as Paris, but his determination burned with the strength of a flame that does not go out. Paris, on the other hand, was accustomed to life in the palacios de Troia, where arrows and swords were a show rather than a reality. However, when facing Menelaus, reality hit him with all his weight. He knew that, if he didn't win, his life didn't mean anything. The fight began with the deaf sound of the shields colliding. Menelaus, with his brutal force, attacked with unstoppable fury, seeking to disarm Paris to mediate. Each coup seemed determined to destroy the young prince, every movement as precise as a lightning in the storm. But Paris, with the agility of a young man who had not yet tried the true horror of the war, dodged, jumping back, maintaining his distance. The fight, although unequal in force, was a cunning dance and reflexes. While Menelaus hit with all his power, Paris responded with arrows and feints, looking for an openness, a weakness in the Greek king. The air was loaded with tension, but soon, the intervention of the gods transformed that mortal duel into something much more complex. While the warriors faced themselves, the gods in Olympus watched with interest. It was impossible for them to stay out. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, who had been friend of the Greeks, saw the duel with a cold smile. He wanted the Greeks to come out victorious, and approached Menelaus, whispering words of encouragement in his ears. "Do it, and your destination will be yours," he said. But not all deities favored the Greeks. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who had been the cause of all this conflict, felt the need to intervene to protect Paris, her protected. With an impetuous gesture, the goddess threw a spell, invoking the strength of her power. Suddenly, Paris felt lighter, more agile, as if a divine energy enveloped it. I no longer felt the weight of Menelaus' sword so strong, nor the fear of facing the Greek king. With renewed determination, Paris triggered an arrow that flew like lightning, pointing directly to Menelaus' heart. But at the last moment, something else happened. Just when the arrow was about to achieve its goal, the god Apollo, protector of the Trojans, intervened surprisingly. With a rapid movement, he diverted the arrow from Paris, saving Menelaus' life in the last second. However, Apollo's intervention was not enough to prevent combat from continuing, because the gods, although powerful, could not decide the destiny of men without more. Menelaus, wounded but not defeated, raised his sword with more fury than ever. The blood of his body was mixed with the rage of his soul, and his desire for revenge was stronger than ever. As it approached Paris, prepared to end his life, the shadow of divine intervention hovered on the confrontation. It was a duel between men, yes, but also a duel between the whims of the gods, who intertwined with the will of mortals. At that moment, the conflict not only involved Menelaus and Paris, but also the gods who, with their strategies and favors, intervened to change the destiny of the heroes. The echo of his interventions resonated in the hearts of the warriors, as a reminder that, in the Trojan War, not only the strength or skill in combat decided the result. So did the whims of the gods, invisible and eternal, playing with the fate of men as if they were pieces on a heavenly chessboard. The duel between Menelao and Paris continued, marked by the divine decisions, the interventions of the gods, and the will of mortals. Neither could escape their destiny, and war continued, fed by anger, love, and revenge. Achilles' fury, as legendary as his skill in war, began to unleash in a day that seemed as common as any other in the Greek camp. The winds blew strongly, dragging with them the voices of the warriors, but something in the air, something in the tension that grew between the Greeks, foreshadowed a much darker storm. The cause of this fury was not an external battle, it was not the roar of the swords or the clash of the shields. No. The cause was much more personal, much more painful. Agamemnon, the supreme leader of the Greek troops, had taken something that belonged to Achilles. He had taken from Bresaida, the captive that Achilles had won after one of the toughest victories against the Trojans, and had taken her as a loot for himself. This offense, so small compared to the horrors of war, became a flame that ignited Achilles' heart with an unstoppable fury. The camp was calm when Agamemnon, rising above all, ordered that Bresaida be delivered to him, a decision that burned the soul of Achilles as an unstoppable fire. Achilles' outrage was so deep that, for a moment, everything in his being went out. He could not believe that his own leader, the man whom he had served with loyalty, would have stripped him of the only reward he had won in the war. Achilles' face, normally serene and full of purpose, was twisted in a grimace of fury. It was not only the loss of captive that devastated him, but the contempt for his honor, to his glory, that Agamemnon had started spread on the ground. "Why do you take away what belongs to me?" Achilles shouted, his voice vibrating with an anger that he knew limits. The men who were close, hearing their tone, instinctively departed, knowing that nothing good could get out of that confrontation. Achilles' fury was not something that could be easily stopped, it was the storm itself, the raging ocean that drags everything in its path. Agamemnon, at first, tried to maintain composure, but his own ego did not allow him to go back. Instead of giving in to Achilles' rage, he faced him with the same hardness with which he had taken the captive. "If you don't give me Bresaida," said Agamemnon, "you won't participate in the war. And if you don't participate, what do you care? You are no longer a soldier like any other." Achilles, with his face reddened by anger, looked at the man who had considered his leader, and for a moment, a mortal silence seized the camp. Achilles' the fury became a guttural, deep cry, as if his soul itself was torn. The anger seized him in such a way that, for a moment, he forgot that he was in the middle of a war. Everything that mattered at that time was the disdain of Agamemnon, that public humiliation that had made Bresaida lose not only his honor, that precious treasure that the heroes could not let anyone take them out. Achilles, being totally belittled, could not contain his anger anymore. His heart throbbed hard, his hands trembled as he squeezed his fist, and his soul cried out for revenge. "I retire from the fight. I will not take part in this war if I am not treated as I deserve." The ground under his feet seemed to tremble, and the words resonated throughout the camp like thunder. The other warriors, terrified by the magnitude of the Achilles' fury, kept silent. They knew that, upon retreating Achilles, they lost the main force in their army. The man who had led with courage and sacrifice, the man whose sword had been the terror of Troy, retired for a simple act of injured pride. But Achilles not only retired from the battlefield. His decision to abandon the war became even more painful for the Greeks when he told them that he would not return until Agamemnon, humiliated and repentant, he fell before him. The battle that was about to get rid of without their participation was no longer a simple matter of territory or glory. It was now a matter of honor, and Achilles, in his fury, retired to mark his territory with the absence of his power. The Greeks, realizing what the withdrawal of Achilles implied, began to fear the course that war would take without their strength. The first signals of despair began to make visible. The Trojans, upon learning of Achilles, raised the mood. Hector, the Trojan prince, began to feel more confident, as if the victory was already at hand. Achilles had not only destroyed its relationship with Agamemnon, but now threatened to destroy the very fabric of the Greek alliance. But what the Greeks did not know, what they could not foresee, was that fury, that uncontrollable anger, would have much deeper impact than any battle won or lost. The absence of Achilles felt like a crack in the heart of the Greeks. Without him, his forces seemed weak, his less safe victories. Every Greek who marched to the battlefield did it with the fear that the war no longer made sense, that there was no longer a leader like Achilles to guide them. And while Achilles, in his anger, but this would not be any day. In the heart of the city, Hector, the prince and Trojan shield, prepared to lead his men with a determination that he did not know limits. Around him, the warriors watched him with respect, some with fear and others with a blind faith in which Hector would guide them to victory. Hector was more than a soldier, it was Troy's soul. In his bearing, in his firm voice and in the way he carried his armor, the burden of protecting his people was reflected. Every step it took was a promise, it would not allow the Greeks to destroy their home. While adjusting his helmet, his mind did not think about glory or recognition. He thought of his wife Andromache, his little son Astyanax, and in the thousands of lives that depended on him. War was not a choice for Hector, it was an obligation. An obligation that would fulfill until his last breath. The Trojan doors opened with a rumble, and Hector went to the forefront of his men, mounted on his war car, with the spear on top and the wind stroking his lair. The Greeks, seeing him appear, felt a chill to travel their backs. Hector was not only a formidable leader, but also a warrior who inspired his troops and terrified his enemies. In front, his voice resonated strongly. Today we fight not only for us, but for our children, our families, and our city. We will not allow the Greeks to snatch what we love. With those words, the Trojans charged forward, following Hector with a renewed fervor. The battle began with a fury that shook the earth. The spears flew like fleeting stars, the shields collided with a deafening sound, and the cries of men filled the air like a choir of pain and determination. Hector, in the midst of everything, was an unstoppable whirlwind. His blows were precise, each calculated movement, and his presence on the battlefield was like a lighthouse for the Trojans. The Greeks, surprised by the ferocity of the attack, tried to resist, but Hector did not give them truce. He led with a courage that seemed superhuman, challenging the danger with each step he took. In a moment, while fighting a group of Greek warriors, their shields splintered under the impact of several swords. But Hector, instead of backward, used it as a weapon, hitting him before taking the spear of a fallen enemy and moving forward. His ability was indisputable, but what most impacted those who watched him was his heart, his ability to risk everything for his people. The gods, from Olympus, looked at the scene carefully. Although some favored the Greeks, even they could not help feeling admiration for Hector. Apollo, Trojan protector, descended to the battle to strengthen the prince, wrapping him in a golden light that made him seem invincible. The Trojans, seeing him shine under divine protection, redoubled their efforts, and the Greeks, weakened and demoralized, began to give ground. Hector did not stop. His goal was clear: expel the Greeks from their camp and protect Troy at all costs. With every step he took, the Greeks retreated, and the Trojans advanced with overwhelming force. Hector's courage was contagious, even the youngest and inexperienced among the Trojans found in him a source of courage. For the Greeks, every moment was a desperate fight to survive. Its leaders, aware that the withdrawal would be seen as a humiliation, tried to reorganize, but the impulse of the Trojans was unstoppable. Finally, after combat hours, the Trojans achieved what seemed impossible: they expelled the Greeks of their camp. The stores burned, the provisions were destroyed, and the Greek warriors, exhausted and defeated, retired to the coasts. Hector, with broken breathing but with a firm look, stopped in the middle of the battlefield. His men surrounded him, cheering him, but he did not raise his arms in victory. His mind was fixed on what was still coming. I knew this was just a small victory in a much bigger war. He knew that the Greeks would return, stronger and more determined. But, for now, he had achieved something invaluable: time for Troy. In the distance, the sound of the waves crashing against the Greek ships filled the air. The Trojans, under Hector's leadership, had shown that they were not an easy enemy to defeat. And while the prince returned to the walls of the city, with the armor stained with blood and the body covered with wounds, his thoughts were not in the glory or in the songs that the bards could compose on it. He thought of his wife, who was waiting for him with a mixture of pride and fear, and in his son, whose laugh was the reason he was still fighting. The war was not over, and Hector knew it. But that day, the Trojans had won more than a battle. They had gained hope. a hope that was reflected in the eyes of each warrior who followed Hector, knowing that, while he was with them, Troy would never be alone. The battle roared like a raging sea around the walls of Troy, a chaos of shouts, swords, and blood that consumed everything in its path. Among the Greeks, despair was palpable. Without Achilles on the battlefield, the balance was inclined dangerously in favor of the Trojans. The Greek heroes fought with courage, but failed to contain the advance of Hector and his troops. And while the war continued, Patroclo, the closest friend of Achilles, watched from the shadows, his heart torn by impotence. Patroclo was no stranger to the danger or glory of war, but his spirit was different. He did not fight for revenge or ambition, he fought for the men who fell around him, for those who cried out for a ray of hope in the middle of the storm. Each wound, every lost life, felt like an unbearable weight on their shoulders. And now, seeing his Greek companions fall under the Trojan spears, he felt he could not stay out for longer. In the Achilles store, the air was heavy with a tense silence. The hero of the Myrmidons remained sitting, motionless, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, mired in his anger and his wounded pride. Patroclo entered, his face full of a mixture of urgency and despair. "We cannot continue like this, Achilles. Men need your strength, your leadership. If you are still sitting here, the war will be lost, and Troy will succeed." But Achilles did not respond. His gaze remained distant, as if his friend's words could not cross the barrier of his anger. Patroclus, with burning heart, made a bold decision, almost suicidal. "If you are not going, I will take your armor and fight in your place. Maybe men find in me the force you deny them." Achilles looked up for the first time, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pain. "You are not like me, Patroclo. You are not made for war as I am. If you leave the battlefield, you will face Hector, and I cannot guarantee that you return." But Patroclo, determined, did not hesitate. "I prefer to die fighting than staying here seeing how everything falls apart." With a heavy sigh, Achilles gave. He handed him his armor, a gleaming creation of Hephaestus that had been forged for a hero, not for a common man. Before Patroclo left, Achilles looked into his eyes and said, "Fight, but you don't pursue glory. Defend men, but don't look for Hector to face. Promise me that you will return." Patroclo nodded, but in his heart he knew that those words were a promise that he might not fulfill. When Patroclo appeared on the battlefield with the Achilles armor, a roar of hope crossed the Greek ranks. The Trojans, seeing him, thought that the dreaded Achilles had returned, and a wave of fear toured their hearts. The Greeks, revitalized by the presence of those who believed their greatest hero, began to fight with a renewed force. But Hector, more experienced and guided by his instinct in Guerrero, found a gap in the defense of Patroclus. With a fast and accurate movement, his spear pierced his enemy's chest. Patroclo fell to the ground, life slowly escaping from his body. The Greeks, seeing him fall, shouted with horror, while the Trojans cheered their victory. Hector leaned over the body of his opponent, removing the Achilles armor as a trophy. But when he lifted the helmet, he discovered the face of Patroclo, not that of Achilles. For a moment, Hector stopped, his eyes finding those of the dying. "You weren't you who was looking for," Hector murmured, almost with regret. With his last strength, Patroclo spoke, "Hector, you have won this battle, but you have unleashed the fury of Achilles. My death will not be the end, but the beginning of something you cannot stop." Hector, although moved by words, knew there was no turning back. The war would continue, and he would remain the protector of Troy, regardless of the price. When the news of the death of Patroclo arrived in Achilles, it was as if the entire world crumbled. The fury I had felt before was nothing compared to the pain that now consumed it. Patroclo was not just his friend, it was his soul brother, the only person who had met the true Achilles behind the hero. The shout of pain that he launched resonated throughout the camp, a sound so heartbreaking that he even gave them says listen to him from Olympus. And at that time, Achilles knew there was no other option. The war was no longer only between Greeks and Trojans. Now it was personal. Now, it was between him and Hector. The sky on the battlefield seemed to have darkened, as if the gods themselves had departed from mortals to observe the chaos that were about to unleash. In the Greek camp, a strange silence extended, heavy and suffocating. The soldiers, exhausted and injured, raised their eyes to a figure that emerged from their store, a man whose presence was an omen of death. Achilles, son of Thetis and Peleo, had returned. He was no longer the brilliant warrior that the Greeks venerated, nor the invincible hero of the songs. Patroclus' death had transformed him into something darker, somewhat more terrible. His face, formerly noble and beautiful, was hardened by pain. His gaze burned with a fury that seemed to devour everything in his path. And when he adjusted the new armor that Hephaestus had forged for him, each shiny piece shone like the sun, a reminder that Achilles was not completely human. It was the gun of the gods, and now it was triggered. While he was moving towards his war car, the soldiers in his path left silently, unable to hold his gaze. They knew what their return meant. The battle that would follow would not be like no other. The Greeks, animated by the presence of their greatest hero, felt a mixture of hope and terror. Because although Achilles fought for them, they knew that the fury that moved it was not directed by duty, but by revenge. And in that revenge, there would be no mercy. The battlefield was deployed before him as a bloody board. The Trojans, seeing it appear, frozen. Achilles' stories were legendary, but seeing it in person, covered with the armor of a god, was something else. Some warriors retreated, others murmured prayers to the gods, and a few prepared to face the inevitable. Hector, from the walls of Troy, watched the man who approached, and although he was brave, he could not help feeling a knot in the stomach. He knew that fate was calling him. Achilles did not speak. He did not shout orders or harangue his men. It was not necessary. He took the reins of his car, and with a terrifying speed, he threw himself into combat. His spear cut the air like lightning, and every blow he gave ended with a life. The Trojans, who had been dominating the battle, crumbled at the ferocity of their attack. It was as if a god had descended to the field, and there was no place to hide from his fury. While progressing, Achilles did not simply seek the enemies of the Greeks. His only goal was Hector. Each Trojan who interposed in his way was demolished without mercy, as if they were insignificant obstacles. The earth under his feet was dyed red, and the air was full of the echo of the screams and metal crashing into the metal. The gods themselves watched in silence, some horrified, others fascinated. Zeus, from Olympus, murmured his brothers, "Achilles is not a man at this time. It is a force of destiny, unstoppable and unwavering." The Trojan men tried to reorganize under Hector's orders, but it was useless. The presence of Achilles sowed chaos, and every warrior who faced his anger fell quickly. Hector, deep down, knew that the time to face it was close. While his troops backed into the walls, he stood in the field, with the sword in his hand and looks at the storm that was approaching. Achilles finally reached the foot of the walls of Troy, his dry arrested while he went down to face his destiny. There, a few meters away, was Hector. Both men looked at each other, and at that moment, the world seemed to stop. There were no words, just a silent connection between two warriors who understood that one of them would not survive per day. Hector, with his heart beating hard, raised his sword and took a step forward. I knew I could not go back, not with Troy watching it from the heights. Achilles, on the other hand, advanced with a disturbing calm, the firm spear in his hand. Every step it took seemed to resonate in the air, like a war drum that marked the end. The confrontation was about to begin, and all the eyes, mortal and divine, were put on them. Hector, the Trojan protector, and Achilles, the unbeatable warrior. Two forces aimed at colliding in a clash that would change the course of war forever. The sun was high, relentless, bathing the battlefield in a blinding light that contrasted with the darkness of the hearts of those who watched. From the walls of Troy, the people looked with fear and hope. Below, in the midst of dust and blood, two figures remained motionless, faced as if fate had them itself placed there. Hector, the prince and protector of Troy, and Achilles, the unstoppable warrior driven by a fury that seemed to have no limits. Silence reigned for a moment, a silence that contained the entire weight of the war years. Hector held his sword with both hands, his white knuckles by force with which he grabbed her. He knew that he had no escape, that death surrounded him in the form of that man who stared at him, whose face reflected a mixture of pain and anger. However, he did not go back. His legs were trembling, but not for fear, but because of the awareness of what was at stake. Troy depended on him, and his honor was tied to that moment. Achilles, meanwhile, showed no emotion. There were no words or warnings. In his mind only a name resonated: Patroclus. The fallen friend, the soul brother whose blood cried revenge. Everything in Hector, from his position to his firm gaze, reminded him that this man was responsible for his loss. And that idea filled him with an anger so pure that every fiber of his body seemed to burn. Hector was the first to move. He launched a war cry and threw himself towards Achilles with a speed that surprised those who watched. His sword descended in a perfect arch, seeking to break through the divine armor that protected his enemy. But Achilles was fast, faster than any mortal should be. He dodged the blow with an almost superhuman elegance and counterattacked with a fluid movement, his spear looking for Hector's side. The Trojan prince barely managed to divert the attack with his shield, the impact resonating as a thunder. Every blow they exchanged was a testimony of their skill, of the ability that had led them to be considered the best of their respective sides. Hector fought with the despair of a man who knows that he fights not only for his life, but for his people. Achilles, on the other hand, fought with the cold and lethal precision of someone who no longer feared death. The duel lasted, the two warriors dancing between blows and elusive, each looking for the perfect time to kill the final blow. From the walls, Andromache, Hector's wife, watched with tears in his eyes, his little son in his arms. Every time Hector managed to defend himself, his heart was filled with hope. Every time Achilles attacked, he felt that the ground fell apart under his feet. Finally, fate intervened. Hector, in a desperate attempt to gain advantage, launched his spear with all his forces towards Achilles' chest. The spear flew like a ray, but harmed harmlessly against the shield of the Greek hero, which remained motionless, as if the attack had only been a whisper. Hector was unarmed, vulnerable, and at that time he knew that his end was close. Achilles advanced with a deliberate slowness, his spear pointing directly to Hector's heart. "By Patroclo," he murmured, his voice so low that only Hector could hear her. With a precise and ruthless movement, Achilles sank his gun into the chest of the Trojan prince. Hector fell to his knees, his sword falling to the ground with a deaf noise. Life began to escape his body, but he still had the strength to look up towards his murderer. "I beg you," Hector said in a broken voice, "that you return my body to my family. They allow me a decent burial." But Achilles' I showed no compassion. "As you left Patroclo, I will leave you," he replied, his voice full of pain and hate. With that, Achilles withdrew his spear and let Hector's body fall into dust. But it didn't end there. In an act of fury and challenge, he tied the body to the war car and began to drag him in front of the Troy walls. The cries of horror and crying of the Trojans filled the air. Andromache fell to the ground, her broken heart to see how her husband's body was humiliated. Priamo, the old king of Troy, watched from the heights, with his hands raised to the sky, crying out to the gods for justice. Achilles, oblivious to the screams and regrets, returned to the Greek camp, dragging behind the man who had been Troy's pride. But while he advanced, something inside began to break. Victory, revenge, did not bring with them the relief he had expected. Instead of peace, I only felt a vacuum, a wound that even Hector's death could not heal. And so, under the eyes of the gods, the duel that had sealed the fate of Troy was recorded in everyone's memory. Hector, the noble prince, had fallen, and with him, the hope of his people. But Achilles' fury, far from going out, continued to consume it from within, like a fire that could not be extinguished. The night fell on the Greek camp, wrapping everything in a mantle of silence, broken only by the creak of the torches and sighs of the soldiers. Inside his store, Achilles remained alone, his figure illuminated nothing the light of a lamp. He had spent days in a fury that did not abandon him even after having taken Hector's life. The spilled blood had not calmed the pain of the loss of Patroclo, nor had it filled the emptiness I felt on the chest. Now, under the weight of exhaustion and remorse, he began to hear another voice within himself, one that invited him to stop. Meanwhile, in Troy, the old King Priam prepared for an act that nobody dared to imagine. With a dark mantle covering it and guided by Hermes, the messenger of the gods, descended from the walls and crossed the enemy lines. His heart was beating strongly, not only for the fear of being face to face with the man who had killed his son, but for the desperate hope of recovering Hector's body. The risk did not matter or humiliation, a father had to honor his son, even before the most implacable enemy. When Priamo entered the Achilles store, the Greek hero looked at him with surprise. Before him a man was hunched over by pain, but whose dignity shone even at his most vulnerable moment. Priam advanced slowly, and when he reached Achilles, he fell on his knees. The words that came out of their mouths were as simple as devastating. "I beg you, Achilles," said Priam in broken voice, "that you return my son's body. Not as a king to Guerrero, but as a father to another father. You also know the love of a father, the sacrifice he does for your son." Achilles, motionless, listened to those words as if they were arrows that crossed their soul. Priam did not reproach him at all, he did not talk about justice or revenge. He only told him about love and loss, two emotions that Achilles knew too well. While the old man spoke, images of his own father, fight, began to fill his mind. He remembered him strong, proud, but he also knew that this man aged alone, waiting for a son who may never return. The hero leaned forward, covering his face with his hands. For long moments, no sound came out of his mouth, but his shoulders trembled with the intensity of his emotions. The man who had dragged Hector's body as a trophy now felt the weight of his fury, a burden that crushed him. Finally, Achilles looked up and looked at Priam. In his eyes there was no hate, just a deep fatigue. "I will return it to you," he said in a low voice, but firm. "Your son deserves to rest in peace." Without more words, Achilles got up and left the store. He ordered that Hector's body, which had been treated brutally, was cleaned and prepared. He covered it with a mantle that had once been destined for a celebration, a gesture of respect that seemed to return some humanity to the warrior who had admired so much in combat. When the body was ready, Achilles personally handed it to Priam. In doing so, their hands found themselves briefly, and for a moment, the barriers between enemy and enemy vanished. Both men, united by pain, looked at each other with a silent understanding. Achilles spoke once again, this time with a sincerity that resonated in the air. He was a great man, a great warrior. Priam nodded, his eyes full of tears. "Be careful," he took his son's body and covered him with his arms, as if Hector were a small child again. Without more words, the way back to Troy began, accompanied by a solemn silence that seemed to wrap the entire Greek camp. Achilles stood at the entrance of his store, looking at how the old man disappeared in the distance. Something inside him felt lighter, as if the act of returning Hector had begun to cure a wound that had been open for a long time. But I also knew that war was not over, that violence would continue to claim lives. For the first time, the invincible Achilles wondered if it was really worth it. In the Trojan walls, the torches began to turn on, and the regret for Hector filled the air. The women cried, the men inclined their heads, and the children clung to their mothers. In the center of everything, Priam placed his son's body with a mixture of pain and pride. Hector, the defender of Troy, had returned home. The battlefield was in a tense and strange silence, as if even the gods were containing their breath. Suddenly, the rumbling of helmets broke calm. From the nearby hills, an army of women warriors advanced, with a force that seemed to challenge reality. The Amazon, led by their queen, Penthesilea, had reached Troy, their presence glowing as a lightning in the middle of a dark storm. Penthesilea was an imposing figure, his armor shining under the sun, his firm spear in his hand. His eyes, fierce and determined, watched the chaos of the conflict with the gaze of someone who was born to lead. He had arrived not only to fight, but to honor the Amazon pact with the Trojans and demonstrate that even in the most desperate moments, the courage could prevail. The confrontation was swift. The Amazoas, mounted on their horses, broke into the battlefield with a ferocity that baffled the Greeks. They were fast, lethal, and fought with a coordination that transformed each movement into a mortal dance. The Greek troops, accustomed to facing foreseeable enemies, retreated before these warriors that not only matched their ability, but overcome it in audacity. In the middle of the heat of the fight, Penthesilea stood out as an unleashed storm. his spear found his enemies with mortal precision, and his horse seemed to dance among the fallen warriors. The Trojans, inspired by their presence, redoubled their efforts, feeling that, perhaps, this time, the victory was not so distant. But then Achilles appeared. The Greek hero, who had remained away after the duel with Hector, could not ignore the chaos that the Amazons were causing. In his heart, anger was still burning, although there was also a new concern, a feeling of vacuum that accompanied him since the return of Hector's body. However, on the battlefield, all that was left aside. There, Achilles was the invincible warrior, the weapon of the gods. When their eyes met those of Penthesilea, they both understood that they were destined to face. Achilles saw in her a force and determination that had rarely found in an enemy. Penthesilea, meanwhile, acknowledged a decent rival in him, but also a man marked by tragedy. There were no words between them, only a synchronized movement, an inevitable approach. The clash was brutal. Penthesilea attacked with a speed that would have baffled any other warrior, but Achilles was different. He blocked his spear with his shield and counterattacked with a force that made the air tremble. For long minutes, the two fought with an intensity that paralyzed those who watched them. Each blow, every movement, seemed to be the last one, but both were still standing, matched in skill and determination. Finally, fate intervened. Penthesilea, in an attempt desperate to overcome his enemy, launched a bold attack, looking for a weak point in the defense of Achilles. But he, with the precision of someone who had fought thousands of battles, found the opening in his movement. With an accurate blow, he sank his spear in the chest of Queen Amazon. Time seemed to stop. Penthesilea fell from his horse gracefully, as if even in death, he refused to be less than majestic. Achilles, even with the spear in his hand, approached slowly. When his eyes perched on the face of his fallen opponent, something inside him broke. Penthesilea was not just a warrior, he was someone who had fought with all his being, someone who had faced death with courage and dignity. At that time, Achilles did not see an enemy, but an equal. He knelt with her, her hardened expression softening as she watched her. Some say that he saw a tear in his eyes, others that his gaze contained a mixture of respect and repentance. What was clear was that Achilles, for the first time in a long time, felt more than fury. He felt the weight of what he had done, the cost of being the unbeatable warrior. The Greeks and Trojans, witnesses of the scene, kept silent. Penthesilea's death had been an act of war, but also a moment that transcended the conflict. Achilles, raising slowly, ordered that the queen's body be treated with honor. The Amazons, with the pain engraved on their faces, collected their fallen leader, promising that their memory would live forever. In the walls of Troy, the news of the death of Penthesilea filled the hearts of the Trojans with mourning. He had arrived as a ray of hope, and his fall was a brutal reminder that even the bravest could not escape destiny. But his legacy, his courage and his sacrifice, remained. And in the heart of Achilles, a new weight joined the load it already carried, a burden that no triumph in the war could relieve. The sky was dyed of an ominous grey, as if the gods themselves looked at what was about to happen. Achilles, the invincible hero, raised once again on the battlefield, his imposing figure a lighthouse of power and determination. After so many victories, his name was synonymous with glory and death, a symbol of the inevitable destiny that seemed to wrap the Trojan War. But even the largest are tied to thread that the Moiras weave, and the Achilles thread began to fray. The Greeks advanced with renewed force, driven by the presence of their greatest warrior. Achilles was a whirlwind of fury and precision. His sword cut through the Trojan rows with a terrifying ease, and each fallen enemy was a reminder of his lethal capacity. However, behind his exploits, there was something that began to corrode it, a void that neither the blood nor the victory could fill. He had lost Patroclo, had killed Hector, and still, the war continued. What remained to win? In the Troy walls, Paris watched the chaos from the heights. Despite the fame his face had brought to war, he had never been a warrior like his brother Hector. His arc, however, was his weapon, and his ability with him was no small thing. But what I had the most was somewhat darker, Apollo's favor, the god who had decided to bow the balance against the Greek hero. The divinities, capricious and volatile, had found in Achilles a man who challenged even his designs. And that could not be tolerated. Paris prepared her arch, the rope stirring while signing the battlefield. His gaze noticed Achilles, whose armor shone even under the cloudy sky. A special arrow rested in his hand, one that Apollo had blessed and guided with divine precision. It was a weapon destined to cross the only vulnerability of Achilles, its heel. The same heel as Thetis, his mother, had neglected to submerge it in the Stygia river. In the heat of the battle, Achilles did not perceive the danger. His attention was fixed on the Trojans who fell before him, in the roar of the war that had defined him since his youth. And then, like a silent lightning, the arrow flew. Apollo guided the projectile with invisible hand, taking him to his destination with implacable precision. The tip found the Achilles heel, crossing the meat and the tendon with an impact that resonated as a thunder on the battlefield. The hero hesitated. For a moment, it seemed impossible for something so small to stop someone so big. But reality hit the same force as the pain that his body now ran through. Achilles fell to his knees, the sword escaping from his hand while the blood sprouted from his wound. The Greeks, seeing it fall, frozen. The invincible Achilles, the son of Thetis, was injured. And worse, I was dying. While collapsed on the ground, the war seemed to stop. The warriors, Greeks and Trojans, in disbelief how the man who had been a pillar of force fell like any other mortal. Achilles, lying on the dust of the battlefield, looked at the sky. His thoughts were not in Paris, or in Apollo, even in Troy. At that time, his memories flew towards Patroclus, towards his mother, Thetis, and towards the days before the war, when he could still imagine a different future. Thetis felt the death of his son even before the news reached the sea. In his immortal heart, he knew that fate had claimed Achilles. The waves seemed to rise in a collective lament, as if the natural world itself joined its pain. But on the battlefield, there was no place for regrets. The Greeks collected the body of their hero with reverence, aware that their loss was a blow that could change the course of the war. Achilles died as he had lived, with a mixture of glory and tragedy, a man who challenged the gods and found his end not in the strength of an enemy, but in the destiny that had always persecuted him. While the Greeks took him back to his camp, the sky began to cry, the raindrops mixing with the blood that soaked the field. But even in death, the name of Achilles would not fade. His exploits, his victories, and his fall would be recorded in the memory of men, an eternal reminder that even the greatest heroes are destined to face their end. Paris's death marked a tragic turn in the Trojan War, an event loaded with irony and destined to trigger more chaos. Paris, the prince whose judgment had unleashed everything, had been the cause of so many losses, but had also been the axis around which the fight revolved. Its end not only left a vacuum in Troy, but also uncovered the fissures of a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Paris found its end not in the splendor of the battle, but in a confrontation that mixed revenge and destination. It was Philoctetes, the carrier of the arch of Heracles, who dejected him with an poisoned arrow, guided by the same spirit of justice that had persecuted so many during the war. The hands of Philoctetes, marked by suffering and loneliness, tensed the rope and released the projectile that found Paris's chest. The wound was deadly, but not immediate. The prince fell to the ground, with cloudy eyes and the heart beating frantically while the poison did his job. In his last breath, Paris was taken back to Troy. There, the city murmurs spread like a fire. Citizens, already tired of years of siege and suffering, were discussed between despair and anger. The hero who had brought Helena and started this war now lay in the bed of death. Troy was losing his pillars one by one, and the weight of the conflict fell more and more about those who remained. Paris, with life escaping from his eyes, asked to be taken to the mountain where Oenone, his former lover. Oenone, who had been abandoned by Paris years ago, still kept the power to save him. However, when he saw him arrive, the wound in his heart spoke stronger than any compassion. He refused to help him, refusing to use his skills to cure him. Paris died in that place, not only victim of war, but of the decisions that had defined him. The city did not have time for the duel. Paris's death left a leadership vacuum, and the mantle fell on Deiphobus, his brother. Deiphobus did not possess the charisma or Hector's cunning, nor the seduction capacity of Paris. His leadership was based more on brute force and a sense of duty than on any strategic ability. For many, his rise to power was a desperate attempt to keep Troy together, but the gap between the Trojans and his destiny seemed insurmountable. The new leader took Helena as a wife, a political and symbolic movement to consolidate his position. However, Helena was not the naive woman who had reached Troy years ago. He had seen Hector die, Paris, and so many others. Now, married to Deiphobos, she was trapped in a city that was being devoured by war flames and betrayal. In the Greek field, the news of Paris's death was received with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. Paris was a central figure, but his disappearance did not mean the end of the conflict. The Greeks knew that there were still Trojan heroes willing to fight until the last breath. Deiphobos, although less bright than Hector or Paris, represented the last bastion of Trojan resistance. In the walls of Troy, Deiphobos stood as a man who knew his time was counted. His face reflected the fatigue of years of struggle, but also the determination to protect what was left of his home. Under their command, the Trojans continued to resist, facing the Greeks with the same courage that had always characterized them. But even the bravest begin to break when the shadow of defeat looms on them. In the air, the weight of the inevitable was felt. Every death, every loss, approached Troy one more step towards his fall. Deiphobos knew that he could not sustain the city indefinitely, but he also knew that he would not give up without giving everything he had. In the heart of the war, he clung to the idea that, although the Trojans could be defeated, their honor and sacrifice would be recorded forever in the memory of men. Paris's death was only the beginning of the final act. With each hero that fell, the gods and mortals seemed to walk towards an unavoidable outcome, one in which the destiny of Troy and his last heroes would be sealed once and for all. The night was dense, almost impenetrable, and the Greek camp was mired in a disturbing silence. After years of struggle, endless deaths, and suffering that extended both in men and in the gods, the Greeks were looking for a path to end this war that seemed to have no end. It was then that Ulysses, the most cunning among the heroes, spoke, and his words would change forever the course of history. The war could not win with brute force, he said. Troy would not fall under the weight of swords or ram. He had resisted for a decade because his walls were not only built of stone, but also of loyalty and despair. If they wanted to overcome, they had to enter the city not as enemies, but as a gift that Troy would accept. The idea was so bold that some considered it crazy. A horse, suggested Ulysses, a huge wooden horse that symbolized the surrender of the Greeks, a tribute to the Trojans and the gods. Inside that horse, they would hide their best warriors, ready to attack from the heart of the city. Meanwhile, the rest of the army would pretend to retire, sailing to the horizon to make believe that the war was over. The plan resonated with a mixture of disbelief and hope among Greek leaders. Agamemnon, after a brief pause, gave its approval, and thus began the construction of the horse that would be recorded in memory as an emblem of ingenuity and betrayal. The best carpenters the army got to work. With hands tanned for work and minds in the urgency, they carved the wood structure with impressive precision. Each table fit perfectly, every detail was careful. The horse should not be just a container, it should be a masterpiece, something that the Trojans could not resist. Its size was huge, enough to house dozens of armed men. Its form evoked strength and greatness, as if it were a tribute worthy of the gods. While the horse took shape, the Greeks chose the warriors who would hide inside. Ulysses would lead the group, accompanied by the bravest and capable. It was not only an honor, but a monumental risk. If the Trojans discovered the deception ahead of time, they would all be sentenced to a safe death. But none hesitated to accept the challenge, knowing that the fate of the war hung on this bold movement. When the horse was finished, the Greeks placed it carefully in front of the Troy walls, as if they offered a last supplication to the Trojans. At dawn, the Greek army embarked on their ships, sailing to the horizon while the waves erased their traces in the sand. The Trojans, seeing the withdrawal, felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Was it possible that, after so long, the Greeks would finally have surrendered? The Trojans left their city, cautious at the beginning, but increasingly confident by not finding traces of enemies. His eyes then set up on the horse, that colossus that seemed to arise from the entrails of the earth. Their size and detail left them amazed, and began to discuss what to do with him. Some suggested burning it, fearing that it could be a trap. Others, led by the most superstitious, argued that destroying it could offend the gods. Among the voices that were raised was that of Laocoonte, a priest of Apollo, who warned the Trojans to distrust the Greek gifts. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts," he exclaimed, his face marked by concern. But before his warning could fall deeply, a terrifying event occurred. Snakes sent by the gods arose from the sea and attacked him and his children. Terror spread among the Trojans, and took the event as a divine signal. The horse had to be taken to the city. With great effort, the Trojans transported the horse through the doors of their city. Victorious songs resonated in the streets, while citizens celebrated what they thought was the end of their suffering. The horse was placed in the center of Troy, a symbol of triumph and reconciliation with the gods. The night fell on Troy with a misleading calm. The streets, which hours before were full of celebrations, now rested in a deep silence. But inside the horse, the tension was palpable. The Greek warriors waited, motionless and silently, their hearts beating hard while counting the minutes. Ulysses, with a fixed and determined look, held his sword, ready to lead the attack that would end this endless war. And while the Trojans slept, confident in their apparent victory, the destination sharpened their edge, preparing for the final act of this long and painful conflict. The night that the great wooden horse crossed the doors of Troy, Cassandra, the daughter of Priam and priestess of Apollo, felt the weight of destiny as a yoke on his shoulders. It was a weight to which she was used to, a burden that had accompanied her from the day God granted her the gift of prophecy, only to curse her later with the condemnation that no one believed in her words. Now, that curse seemed to laugh on her face while watching her people celebrated what, for her, was a death sentence. From the towers of the palace, Cassandra saw the figure of the wooden horse, imposing in the heart of Troy. His presence froze his blood. He felt something dark, somewhat funeral, emanating from his interior. He closed his eyes, and, as if the gods themselves spoke to his ear, the visions arrived, armed men leaving the horse, the city wrapped in flames, the sound of the screams, and the brightness of the swords cutting the air. Cassandra ran through the palace halls, her dress waving like a spectrum while trying to warn others. He found his father, King Priam, surrounded by his directors. Everyone was celebrating, drinking wine, relieved by the withdrawal of the Greeks. The young priestess broke into the room, her ruffled hair and overflowing eyes of despair. "Father, please listen to me," he supplied, kneeling in front of him. "That horse is a trap. It is full of enemy warriors. Tonight, Troy will burn if we do not destroy it. We must act now." Priam, accustomed to his daughter's outbursts, sighed tiredly. His face, marked by the years and war, softened while placing a hand on Cassandra's shoulder. "My little, you have suffered a lot in this war, and your mind is tired. But this time, we can trust that the Greeks have left. You have nothing to fear." King's words fell like stones on Cassandra. He wanted to shout, "Shake it," but I knew it was useless. Apollo's curse interposed between his truth and the reason for those who listened to her. Priam got up and returned to the table, ignoring his daughter's sobs. Cassandra did not give up. He left the palace and ran to the streets, where citizens celebrated around the horse. His shouts racked the night as a warning song, "Side me. It's a trap. The enemy is inside. If we do not destroy it, we will all perish. Troy will be ashes before dawn." But people didn't listen to her. Some laughed, others pointed to her as crazy, and a few looks away, uncomfortable at their intensity. For them, Cassandra was the king's daughter, yes, but also a broken woman, tormented by visions that no one could understand. Her truth was a burden that isolated her from the rest, an invisible wall that separated her even from those she loved. While trying to convince the guards to burn the horse, a group of children began to make fun of it, imitating their gestures and words with a cruelty that only ignorance can justify. Cassandra looked at them with a sadness that went beyond humiliation. They were not them, neither their father, nor the citizens. It was the destiny, cruel and relentless, who had decided that his warnings would always fall into deaf ears. He finally separated, exhausted. He went up to the city walls and sat in a dark corner, where the lights of the torches barely arrived. From there, the horse observed, that imposing figure that seemed to challenge her with her immobility. The stars shone in the sky, indifferent to human suffering, and Cassandra felt an overwhelming loneliness. Their thoughts wandered between hopelessness and resignation. I knew what was going to happen. I knew that, at dawn, Troy would no longer exist as he knew her. But I also knew there was nothing to change it. It was as if it were trapped in a dream where everything is repeated, and although one shouts and fights, the end is always the same. Cassandra closed her eyes and let tears flow. His heart was full of love for his city, for his family, even for those who made fun of her. But she was also full of rage towards the gods, towards Apollo, towards the curse that had condemned her to be a prophet without voice. The silence of the night was broken by the songs of the Trojans, who continued to celebrate. In their midst, Cassandra could feel the beats of the dozens of hearts that awaited hidden inside the horse. The Greek warriors were there, waiting for the moment when the darkness and carelessness of their enemies gave them the advantage. When Alba's first lights began dyeing the sky, Cassandra got up. His face, marked by crying, reflected a mixture of sadness and dignity. He knew that this would be the last time he would see dawn about Troy, but he also knew that he did not regret having tried to save her. Although no one listened to her, although her truth was ignored, her love for her land remained intact. And while the Trojans continued to sleep, the tragedy that Cassandra had seen in their visions was about to begin. Dawn in Troy brought with him a misleading calm. The songs and laughter last night had given way to expectant silence. The inhabitants woke up with a feeling of relief. War, after 10 years of suffering, seemed to have come to an end. From the walls, the beams confirmed that the Greek ships had disappeared, leaving the waters of the Aegean calm and deserted. But in the center of the city, the wooden horse remained motionless, as a silent witness of what was to come. The Trojans left their homes, still incredulous to the apparent withdrawal of the enemy. Some approached the horse with curiosity, touching the polished wood, admiring its size and perfection. It was an imposing monument, a work that seemed more divine than human. For many, it was the proof that the gods had finally favored Troy, tilting the balance against the Greeks. In the city council, it was discussed what to do with the mysterious gift. Some, distrustful, suggested destroying it. Burning it, they said, would be the safest. But others, headed by Priam, argued that the horse should be a tribute to the gods, an offering that should not be desecrated. The tragedy of the Laocoon priest and his children, devoured by snakes on the eve, was interpreted Ada as a divine warning. The horse had to be respected and taken to the interior of the city. Thus, with great effort, the Trojans began to move the horse. They used thick sogers and wooden rollers to drag it through the city's doors, while citizens watched with amazement. The creak of the wood and the cries of the men filled the air, but no one noticed the small noises that came from the inside of the horse, nor the sparkles of movement that were hidden behind the slits. When they finally introduced it, they placed it in the center of the main square, in front of the temple of Athena. The Trojans celebrated their victory with songs and dances around their new trophy. The streets were filled with music and laughter, and the wine ran like never before in a decade of war. It was a night of joy, relief, renewed hope. But not everyone shared joy. From a section, Cassandra watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He had warned again and again about the danger of the horse, he had shouted until he was without voice, but no one had heard her. Now, while her people danced carefree, she could feel the shadow of the tragedy that hidden on them. It was as if the horses would breathed, as if hiding a heart that was beating with dark intentions. When the night advanced, the Trojans, drunk with joy and tiredness, began to retire to their homes. The lights of the torches went out one by one, and the bustle of the celebration gave way to a disturbing silence. In the square, the horse remained lonely in the moonlight, its shadow projecting as a spectrum on the cobblestones. Within him, the Greek warriors waited, motionless and patient, each containing their breathing so as not to reveal their presence. Ulysses, the architect of the plan, was among them. With his sword in hand and the alert senses, he watched through a slit how the city plunged into the dream. He could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of leading his men in this decisive act. Everything depended on the Trojans continued to believe in the illusion they had created. Meanwhile, in the hills beyond Troy, the Greek army awaited silently. His ships had not really retired, they were hidden in a nearby cove, ready to return as soon as the signal was given. Agamemnon, Menelaus, and the rest of the leaders waited with the same mixture of tension and hope. They knew that, if the plan failed, the 10-year sacrifice would have been in vain. The hours passed, and the city plunged into a deep dream. The warriors inside the horse began to move cautiously, loosening the wooden panels that kept them locked. The air inside was dense, loaded with sweat and anxiety, but none hesitated. It was the time they had been waiting for, the climax of a strategy that depended on their audacity and precision. While the stars knocked on Troy, the horse, that figure that had symbolized the victory for the Trojans, prepared to reveal their true purpose. The night was about to transform into chaos, and the destinations of heroes, kings, and entire cities hung from a delicate thread that would soon break. The darkness of the night broke with the wooden crunch when the horse's side opened. The Greek warriors emerged in silence, agile shadows that slid between the streets of Troy. Ulysses, with the acute look and the determination of a man who could not fail, led his men to the city's doors. There, with skill and quickly, they folded the sleepy guards and opened the huge bronze doors so that the rest of the Greek army would enter. The ships, hidden in the vicinity, had brought the soldiers back under the coverage of darkness. With bound torches and drawn swords, the Greeks invaded the city. It was as if a river of fire flowed through the streets of Troy, consuming everything in its path. The first screams of alarm were mixed with the sound of the metal crashing and the flames devouring ceilings and walls. The sleeping city woke up, but too late. In the palace, Priam was one of the first to get up. Disoriented, the old king tried to understand the chaos that was unleashed around him. Seeing the Greek warriors to cross the palace runners, he knew that his kingdom was lost. With the weight of defeat on his shoulders, he ran towards the altar of Zeus, seeking divine protection, but not even the gods could save him. Neoptolemo, son of Achilles, reached it right there. Without mercy, he folded him in front of his own family, marking the end of the Trojan dynasty. While the palace burned, the streets became a battlefield. Some Trojan heroes did not give up easily. Aeneas, protected by its destination and by the design ios of the gods, fought with courage. With his sword and shield, he guided a group of survivors through the ruins, looking for an exit from the city. Beside them, the most loyal resisted, trying to protect their families and how little was left of Troy. Helen, Hector's brother, took arms and directed the few soldiers who were standing. He fought with ferocity, his face illuminated by the flames that devoured the temples and the houses. But the numerical disadvantage was overwhelming, and one by one, his companions fell. Helen managed to escape along with a few, carrying with him the memories of a city that no longer existed. Cassandra, on the other hand, remained in the temple of Athena, where she had sought refuge. His screams resonated on the walls of the enclosure, cursing the gods and the men who had taken their city to ruin. When Ajax the child found her, she faced him with the dignity of those who no longer fear death. However, his destiny would be cruel, a last offense to add to the long catalogue of suffering he had endured. Women and children were captured, destined to become slaves or war trophies. Andromache, Hector's wife, saw how her son Astyanax was taken from her arms and thrown from the city walls, a brutal act that reflected the ruthless logic of the war. His pain was the reflection of so many other mothers and wives, condemned to load with Troy ashes in their hearts. Meanwhile, the Greeks looted the temples and destroyed the symbols of Trojan greatness. Statues, jewelry, and sacred objects were taken as loot, while the flames consumed what could not be carried. The voices of the priests, crying out for divine intervention, went out under the rumble of structures collapsing. Trojan's resistance was brave but ephemeral. The city, once glorious and majestic, became a cluster of smoking before dawn. The streets, which were previously witnesses of celebrations and festivities, were now full of bodies and rubble. The smell of smoke, blood, and death permeated the air. Ulysses, observing destruction from a height, felt a mixture of triumph and empty. They had won, yes, but the price had been high, and the glory of their victory was tinged with tragedy. Not only for the Trojans, but also for the Greeks, whose souls now carried the weight of the massacre. In the first lights of the day, the echo of cries and laments was the only thing that remained of Troy. A city that had resisted during a decade of war had been reduced to ashes in one night. But in the shadows of that destruction, some survivors, led by Aeneas, managed to escape, carrying with them the promise of a new beginning, a ray of hope among the ruins. The city of Troy, once a symbol of splendor and strength, lay in ruins. Among the rubble, the regrets of the survivors resonated as an echo of the tragedy. The fate of the Trojans, those who had not fallen during the night of the invasion, was now written with letters of blood and suffering. The war, which had promised glory and honor, ended up being a cruel sentence for all. In the royal palace, Priam's body remained inert next to the altar of Zeus. The king, who had ruled with wisdom and justice, found an unworthy end. Neoptolemo, Achilles' son, showed no mercy or respect in killing him in front of his family's terrified eyes. The old man's blood stained the altar, as if the gods themselves had abandoned Troy. Priam died not only as a defeated king, but as a father stripped of everything he loved, his city, his lineage, his honor. Hecuba, his wife, was taken as a prisoner. The queen, who had once been the maternal figure of Troy, walked hunched over the weight of pain. Her eyes, who had seen the splendor of the city, now contemplated the ashes and the chains that tied her. However, even in despair, Hecuba did not let the dignity abandon her. His words, full of a resigned bitterness, seemed to curse both the Greeks and the gods themselves for their cruelty. Andromache, Hector's wife, faced an even more heartbreaking destination. Hector's loss had been a devastating blow, but nothing could prepare her for the moment the Greeks snatched her son, Astyanax. The little one was condemned to die, thrown from the top of the walls to prevent one day from looking for revenge. Andromache, helpless, was forced to witness the act, a pain that no human heart should endure. Then, chained, she was assigned as a slave to Neoptolemo, the same man who had killed her father-in-law. Every day he lived under his yoke was a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, also faced her ineludible destination. Despite his constant warnings about the fall of Troy, no one had believed in his visions. Now, as a prisoner, her suffering did not end. Ajax the youngest, without respect for the gods or for humanity, dragged her from the temple of Athena and took her as a war loot. This outrage not only marked Cassandra, but also sealed the fate of Ajax, who would eventually be punished by the gods for his sacrilege. Helena, whose beauty had been the spark that lit the war, walked among the Greeks as a controversy figure. Menelao, her husband, had claimed her property, but resentment and humiliation obscured their intentions. Helena, aware of her position, kept her head up, as if her pride were the only thing she had left. However, her return to Sparta would be loaded with tension and distrust, a life marked by the whispers of those who would blame her for the tragedy. Meanwhile, the Greeks divided the captured Trojans as if they were mere possessions. Women and children were distributed as slaves among warriors, their destinations reduced to work or pleasure tools. Those who had once lived between the riches and the nobility of Troy now faced a life of servitude and humiliation. In a corner section of the ruins, Aeneas, one of the few Trojan heroes that had survived, watched the dawn with a mixture of pain and determination. He had lost his home, his family, and everything he knew, but the gods had other plans for him. With a small group of followers, he loaded his old father Anchises on his shoulders and took his son Ascanio. On the face of Aeneas, you could read the promise that Troy's fall would not be the end of everything. He would take the seeds of his people to a new destination, a future that still had to be built. The tragedy of the Trojans was written in the wind that ran through the ruins of the city, in the tears that fell on the burned earth, and in the stories that the survivors would tell throughout generations. His pain was immense, but so was his legacy, one that would live not only in the memoirs of men, but also in the will of the few who refused to perish completely. Troy, although destroyed, would not die at all. Her spirit would survive in the hearts of those who loved her and in the new lands that her children would one day call. The victory in Troy was not the glorious end that the Greeks had imagined. The return home, the Nostos, became an odyssey full of challenges, tragedies, and gloomy destinations. Trojans' flames still burned in their memoirs, but the waters of the Aegean await them with storms, betrayals, and the relentless justice of the gods. Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek armies, undertook his journey with his forehead high, but his way home was loaded with dark omen. He had sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to obtain the winds that took the Greeks to Troy, and that sin would not be forgotten. When he finally arrived in Mycenae, his wife Clytemnestra received him with apparent hospitality, but welcome was a farce. She, consumed by the resentment for the sacrifice of her daughter and manipulated by her lover Aegisto, planned her revenge. In the intimacy of his palace, while Agamemnon bathed, Clytemnestra murdered him coldly, sealing a tragic destination for the house of Atreo. On the other hand, Menelao, king of Sparta, managed to return to his land with Helena, the woman whose beauty had unleashed war. His return, however, was not exempt from evidence. The storms took him to distant lands, such as Egypt, where he wandered for years before reuniting with his home. Although he recovered Helena, the relationship between the two never was the same. The scars of the war interposed with each other, and the whispers of Helena's infidelity continued to chase Menelao, reminding him that victory does not always bring peace. Ulysses, the cunning king of Ithaca, was perhaps the one who suffered the most on his return. The gods, especially Poseidon, punished him for his arrogance and the desecration of the Trojan temples. His trip, which had to last days, extended for 10 long years. He faced mermaids who tried to seduce him with his songs, cyclops that devoured their men, and goddesses who tried to retain him in distant islands. Each obstacle was not only a physical test, but also a fight against hopelessness and oblivion. In the end, his return to Ithaca was a bitter triumph, marked by the loss of many of his classmates and the need to reconquer his own home. Other heroes did not even have the opportunity to return. Ajax the youngest, who had outraged Cassandra in the temple of Athena, was persecuted by the fury of the gods. In the sea, his ship was destroyed or a storm, and although he managed to reach a rock in the middle of the ocean, his arrogance condemned him. He shouted that not even the gods could defeat him, and Poseidon, offended, sank the rock, taking Ajax to a lonely death. Diomede, the brave warrior who had injured gods in battle, returned to Argos just to find that his position in the city had been usurped. Betrayed by those who once acclaimed him as a hero, left his homeland and exiled, looking for a new home away from the memories of the war. Philoctetes, who with his arch had killed Paris and secured the fall of Troy, also faced the disdain of his own people. Although his heroism was indispensable, the smell of his former wound, which had been his torment for years, turned him into a couple. Without a place to be welcome, Philoctetes lived his days in solitude, accompanied only by the memoirs of his contribution in the war. The anger of the gods was not limited to men. The Greek cities, who had celebrated victory with excesses and arrogance, also suffered their punishment. Epidemics, famine, and internal conflicts extended throughout Greece, as if Troy's flames had ignited a curse that would persecute them forever. That war, which had promised greatness, left a legacy of ruins and pain. The Nostos was not a simple physical return. It was a trip to a home that was no longer the same, towards families and lands transformed by time and tragedy. The Greek heroes, who had left with dreams of gloria, returned as men marked by guilt and loss. The songs of the bards told their stories, but in their hearts, the victory felt like a defeat. The gods, who had played with their destinations, looked from Olympus while mortals faced the consequences of their ambitions and errors. The waters of the Aegean, who had witnessed his departure, now carried the echoes of his suffering. Greece, despite the victory, would never be the same again. The heroes returned, yes, but in their souls, many never left Troy. The sky on Troy still shone with the glow of the flames when Ulysses embarked towards Ithaca. From the beginning, the destiny of Ulysses was marked by Poseidon's fury. He had blinded the Polyphemus, the son of the god of the sea, and the arrogance with whom he had boasted of his feat caused the anger of the powerful Pose. The waters that had to guide it back to Ithaca became its greatest enemy, an infinite labyrinth of storms and deviations. Ulysses's first stumble was not with monsters or storms, but with the sweet song of temptation. On the island of the Lotophages, some of their men tested the fruit of the lotus, a plant that erased the memories and filled the heart of a numb peace. Cattered in a state of oblivion, they forgot their homes, their families, even their purpose. Ulysses, firm in their determination, dragged them back to the ships, their screams of protest echoing as a warning of how easy it is to get lost in the comfort of the unknown. But the true test of Ulysses, which would mark his trip, arrived when his ships ran on the island of the Cyclops. There, the giant Polyphemus caught them in his cave, devouring some of his men brutally. Ulysses, using his ingenuity, devised a plan to escape. He drank the monster with wine and, when he fell into a deep sleep, he blinded his only eye with a burning stake. The scene was terrifying. Polyphemus shook the island, and Ulysses's men, trembling, clung to the Cyclops as sheep to escape. However, Ulysses's cunning had a cost. By proclaiming his name to Polyphemus he fled, he unleashed the curse that would lengthen his return for years. The tests continued, each more disconcerting than the previous one. On the island of Circe, the sorceress transformed its men into pigs, but Ulysses, protected by the help of god Hermes, confronted Circe and forced her to free her crew. For a year, Ulysses remained on the island, caught between the desire to return home and the temptation to forget his concerns in the arms of the sorceress. Finally, Penelope's memory promoted him from leaving, although not before receiving warnings about the dangers that were still waiting for him. The horrors of the trip not only lived on Earth, but also in the sea. The sirens, with their hypnotic song, tried to seduce him towards his death. Ulysses, showing his cunning once again, ordered his man residential that covered their ears with wax while he tied to the mast of the ship. Trapped between the mortal beauty of his voices and his desperate desire to live, Ulysses heard the song, but survived. His will prevailed, although the echo of those voices was recorded in his memory as a reminder of his vulnerability. The currents later took him to the narrow step between Scylla and Charybdis, two marine monsters whose proximity made it impossible to avoid one without facing the other. Ulysses opted for the minor evil, pass near Scylla, the creature of multiple heads, at the expense of some of his men. The screams of those who were dragged into the abyss resonated in their mind long after leaving that place behind. Physical and emotional fatigue began to weigh in him and his men, but the greatest blow came when his classmates, disobeying his orders, killed and ate the holy Ilios wholly. Enraged, Ilios demanded Zeus to punish mortals. A storm sent by the king of the gods destroyed the ships and ended the life of his entire crew. Ulysses was alone, shipwrecked in the vast ocean, his spirit as fractured as the remains of his boat. Finally, he arrived on the island of Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso kept him prisoner for 7 long years. Although he offered immortality if he remained with her, Ulysses never stopped longing for Ithaca, his home. His days passed between the fight against the desire to surrender and the hope that the gods one day would free him. It was Athena, always its protector, who interceded against Zeus to allow his departure. Ulysses, once again, found himself at sea, challenging the waves and his own exhaustion to continue the trip that seemed to have no end. Ulysses's Odyssey was not just a path to Ithaca, it was a transformation. Each test, every loss, and every sacrifice forged him in someone different. The hero who had left with arrogance and confidence would return as a man marked by pain, but also by resilience. Troy's shadow was still following him, but his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where Ithaca was waiting for him. The Trojan War, with its splendor and tragedy, left an indelible legacy in the hearts and minds of those who survived, and in the stories that bards would sing for generations. It was a confrontation that, although driven by honor and glory, revealed the depths of ambition, cruelty, and human fragility. More than a confrontation of swords and spears, it was a reflection of the passions and defects that define humanity. The heroes who rose in the conflict, from Hector to Achilles, embodied universal values such as courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Hector, the Trojan prince, became a symbol of love for his homeland and his family. His bravery, facing a destiny that knew inevitable, transformed him into a tragic hero whose death would resonate as a warning about the inevitability of fate. On the other hand, Achilles, the invincible, taught us that even the strongest have invisible injuries. Their anger, their pride, and pain for the loss of Patroclus showed him as a deeply human man, caught between immortal glory and the desire for a simple life. However, behind the heroic songs and epic battles, there is a dark truth: war is never fair or glorious. The destruction of Troy was total. The walls that had protected their people for years were reduced to ashes, and the flames devoured not only the palaces, but also the hopes of those who survived. The women were taken as ankle boots, the children killed to avoid future revenge, and the elderly, such as King Priam, died cruelly, leaving an echo of desolation that would persist beyond generations. The gods, who seemed to play with the destinies of mortals and cities, showed divine indifference to human suffering. His personal rivalries, his whims, and revenge were the engine of many of the disasters. How fragile is the human destiny when it is in the hands of beings that treat life as a game? The Trojan War was a bitter reminder of how divine and human ambitions can converge to destroy what is most loved. Heroism, although immortalized in songs, had a price that no one was willing to pay. The Greeks returned to their homes with scars not only in the body, but also in the soul. The glory obtained in Troy was ephemeral, and the consequences of the conflict, devastating. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, the betrayal and death of Agamemnon, the long odyssey of Ulysses, the tragedy of Ajax, and the solitude of Diomede are examples of how victory does not always mean triumph. In the case of the Trojans, their legacy was no less painful. Andromache, Hecuba, and Cassandra survived, but their lives were marked by slavery and loss. Priam's lineage was practically eradicated, and the great Trojan heroes lived only in the memories of those who cried them. Beyond human losses, war also left a lesson about the futility of conflicts born of pride and greed. Paris, when choosing Aphrodite and unleashing war, acted by desire and vanity, not out of necessity. The Greeks, in their eagerness to recover Helena, brought their ambition to the extreme, ignoring the human costs of their crusade. However, it is also fair to recognize that from this tragedy teachings arose. The stories of war, transmitted through generations, not only glorified courage, but also warned about the consequences of hatred and pride. The Iliad, more than an epic of war, is a meditation on the fragility of life and the importance of finding a purpose that transcends violence. The legacy of the Trojan War lives in myths and in collective memory. It is a reminder that true heroism does not reside on the battlefield, but in the elections we do to preserve what we love. The value is not to destroy, but to protect. And the most important lesson is that the price of pride and ambition can be too high. The Trojan War left us with unforgettable images: Hector's courage in front of the doors of his city, Priam's crying to beg for his son's body, Achilles' anger, Ulysses' cunning, and the suffering of Cassandra. All these scenes, at the same time epic and deeply human, remind us that in each battle, beyond victory or defeat, what is always lost is humanity itself. When Troy's flames finally went out and the war dust settled, the tragedy that was lived there was not buried with his heroes and his victims. On the contrary, he was reborn in the words of the poets, who, with their art, transformed chaos and destruction into an immortal legacy. The Trojan War, with all its horrors and glories, became the central theme of the stories that would resonate over the centuries, transmitted by the voices of bards and singers, and finally inscribed in eternity by classical authors such as Homer. Homer, the blind poet of ancient Greece, was the first to give a lasting weight to history in his work The Iliad, an epic poem that does not tell the entire war, but a crucial fragment, Achilles' anger. With a heartbreaking lyricism, Homer showed not only the confrontations between the heroes, but also the moral dilemmas, the contradictory feelings, and the inevitability of death that defines human experience. The Iliad is not just a war song, it is a meditation on pride, revenge, compassion, and loss. The structure of the poem captures the rawness of the battle, but also the tenderness of human moments. How not to shudder with Hector's desperate courage when he says goodbye to his wife Andromache and his son Astyanax, knowing that he will never see them again? How not to feel the weight of destiny when Priam, in an act of deep pain, kneels before his son's murderer, begging him for Hector's body? These passages, immortalized in dactylic hexameters, not only celebrate the greatness of the heroes, but expose the fragility of men. But Homer did not end his work with La Iliada. In the Odyssey, another aspect of the conflict explored, the sequelae. Through the trip of Ulysses back to Ithaca, Homer showed how the war left indelible marks in the survivors. Nostalgia, loss, and desire for redemption became the main themes of this second epic, which complements the brutality of the Iliad with a reflection on resilience and hope. However, Homer was not the only poet to preserve the history of Troy. The so-called epic cycle, a set of poems that have mostly been lost, completed the events of the war and its consequences. Works such as Cyprian narrated the events prior to the conflict, such as the Paris trial and the abduction of Helena. The Aethiopide had the arrival of Trojan reinforcements, including Queen Amazon Penthesilea, and the death of Achilles. These stories, although less known today, were fundamental to build the complete mosaic of war. Beyond Greece, Troy echo resonated in other cultures. The Romans, fascinated by history, claimed their part of the legacy through authors such as Virgil. In his work La Aeneida, Virgilio narrated the flight of Aeneas, a Trojan prince, after the destruction of the city. The award not only served as a continuation of the Trojan events, but also as a means to connect the Trojan history with the mythical foundation of Rome, joining the tragedy of the past with the imperial aspirations of the present. The figure of Aeneas, carrying his old father Anchises on his shoulders while fleeing from the ruins of Troy, became a symbol of resistance and reconstruction. Virgil, with his elegant prose and his dominance of the epic, showed that even in the midst of the most absolute defeat a spark of hope may arise, a promise of a new beginning. Over the centuries, Troy's story continued to inspire poets and writers. In the Middle Ages, the Trojan stories were reimagined in Europe, becoming stories of gentlemen and maidens who resonated with the values of the time. The epic poems gave way to chronicles, theatrical works and novels that explored from new angles the complexity of the war and its protagonists. Even in modern times, the Trojan War remains an inexhaustible source of inspiration. His ability to capture human contradictions, glory and suffering, love and hate, hope and despair, says he will never be forgotten. Each generation finds in these stories something that resonates with its own experience, a lesson that still has relevance. The poets, shaping the story, not only preserved the events, but gave them a deeper purpose. In their verses, spears and swords became metaphors of men's internal struggles. The heroes, despite their strength and courage, revealed themselves as tragic figures, unable to escape the destiny that ruled them. The Song of the Poets, born of Troy's ashes, reminds us that history does not belong only to the past. Live in the words that transmit it, in the hearts that listen to it, and in the lessons that, generation after generation, continue to teach us about what it means to be human. The ruins of Troy, hidden among the Hisarlik hills in the current Turkey, rise as an enigmatic testament of history, a tangible vestige of a distant past that has captivated human imagination for centuries. For years, the city of Troy was considered only a myth, a mythical place mentioned in Homer's Iliad, until, in the early 19th century, the history of the Trojan War came to life thanks to the efforts of a German archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann, obsessed with the idea of finding the mythical city of the Trojans, began its excavations in 1870. With great determination and an almost unwavering faith in Homer's words, he dug in the Hisarlik hills, looking for traces of the old city. At first, many doubted their methods and the possibility that the Troy of the Iliad was real. However, the discovery of a series of large senior wall structures and an impressive treasure, known as the Priam Treasury, provided tangible evidence that at least one city with similar characteristics to that of the epic Trojan had existed. The importance of Troy in the context of the Bronze Age is indisputable. The remains discovered in Hisarlik reveal a city that was in its peak between the 13th and 13th centuries BC, a time of intense commercial and cultural interactions between the civilizations of Anatolia, Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Troy was not only a key shopping center but also a strategic point at the intersection of routes between Asia Minor and the Balkan Peninsula, which made it a place of great political and economic relevance. The ruins of Troy show several layers of construction, indicating that the city was inhabited during different historical periods. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 levels of settlements, some of which correspond to periods after the Bronze Age, when the city was destroyed and rebuilt several times. However, the layer that most awakens the fascination of the researchers is the one that corresponds to Troy 6 and 7, which date back to the 13th century BC, coinciding with the time traditionally associated with the Trojan War according to the Homeric chronology. In this layer, archaeologists discovered huge fortification walls, designed to protect the city from possible invaders. These walls, with their solid structure and monumental doors, show that Troy was a city of great military importance. In addition, there were evidence of a great fire, which suggests that the city could have been destroyed by a violent attack, which some interpret as a possible correspondence with the famous destruction of Troy that Homer described in his epic. But did the Trojan War really occur as poets tell? Archaeological evidence does not allow to confirm all the details of the famous history of the Iliad, such as duels between Achilles and Hector or the direct intervention of the gods. However, what archaeologists have found broken in the ruins suggests that Troy was, in fact, an important center of power in the region, which suffered a series of war conflicts, probably driven by trade, territorial control or internal rivalries. Some scholars suggest that the Trojan War could have been the result of a series of clashes over the years, instead of a single confrontation. Beyond the walls and doors, the excavations in Troy have revealed a rich variety of objects that offer a look at the daily life of their inhabitants. Tools, ceramics, jewelry, weapons, and food remains that provide a window to the material culture of the Bronze Age have been found. These objects not only reveal the sophistication level of the city, but also their commercial connections with other civilizations. For example, pieces of ceramics of Mycenaean origin have been found, indicating a cultural and commercial exchange with the inhabitants of continental Greece. Another fascinating aspect of Trojan excavations is the discovery of the so-called treasure rooms, which contain a series of luxury objects, such as gold weapons and exquisite pieces of art. These findings, together with the famous Priam treasure, have been interpreted by some as evidence of the wealth and power of the city during its peak. Although the exact identity of the kings and historical figures of Troy remains uncertain, these treasures suggest that the city was governed by a rich and powerful elite, which could have played an important role in the diplomatic and commercial relations of the region. However, despite all the advances in the archaeological understanding of Troy, a great uncertainty persists on how Homer's epic history fits in the real historical context. The Iliad, with its splendid parade of heroes, gods, and battles, is probably not a literal historical story, but a mixture of real events, legends, and mythology. Homer, as a poet, wove a narrative that reflected the ideals and values of his own society, rather than a precise chronicle of the events that occurred thousands of years before. The Troy of the Iliad is, therefore, a city built not only on the sand of history, but also about the dust of imagination and literary interpretation. Over the decades, excavations in Troy have continued, throwing new lights on this old city. While it is impossible, with an influence that covered a large part of the Aegean region during the Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans stood out not only for their impressive architectural and artistic achievements, but also because of their prominence in epic stories, such as Homer's Iliad. Its civilization is a bridge between mythology and history, a culture whose traces seem to be intertwined with the legends of the Trojan War, although the line between the mythical and the historical remains diffuse. The Mycenaeans flourished approximately between the 15th and 12th centuries, in an era characterized by the consolidation of fortified cities and a system of palaces governed by reyes. Its main power center was the city of Mycenae, located on the Peloponnese Peninsula, although other cities such as Tirinto, Pylos, and Gla were also important. These palaces, built with huge stone blocks, were both administrative and residential centers, and served as political and economic control centers in the region. Its walls, formed by gigantic stones embedded without mortar, demonstrated the technical ability and wealth of this civilization. One of the most fascinating elements of the Mycenaean is their language, the Mynical Greek, which has been largely deciphered through inscriptions on clay tablets known as Linear B. These texts, which mainly record administrative accounts and tax records, they offer a vision of the hierarchical structure and the system canonico of the Mycenaean society, but also give clues about their participation in military activities. The richness of the Mycenaean cities, together with their centralized organization, allowed them to project power and expand their influence throughout the Aegean Sea and beyond. In mythology, the Mycenaean are presented in the form of the Achaeans, the group of Greek warriors marching to Troy in an expedition to recover Helen, Menella's wife, king of Sparta. Through Homer's stories, Achaeans are shown as brave and powerful heroes, but also as tragic figures trapped in a destination and war cycle. Achilles, Agamemnon, Ulysses, Nestor, Diomedes, Ajax. All of them are Achaean heroes, which symbolize the ideal of bravery in combat, but also the cruelty and suffering that war brings. Historically, it is not easy to separate myths from real events. The Trojan War, although narrated as a conflict between Achaeans and Trojans, is wrapped in the legend fog. However, there are indications that war, as Homero describes it, could have had a historical background in the context of the commercial and territorial tensions of the region. The Mycenaean, as powerful merchants and conquerors of the Aegean, had interest in controlling trade routes and territories near the current Turkey. Troy, with its strategic location on the north coast of the Aegean Sea, would have been an attractive objective for any civilization that would seek to dominate trade between Asia Minor and Europe. Archaeological excavations have confirmed the existence of a war conflict that could have affected Mycenaean cities. In particular, the city of Mycena shows evidence of a violent collapse around the 12th century BC, which has led some archaeologists to suggest that the Trojan War may have been a reflection of the broader conflicts that involved the cities of the region. However, as is common with Bronze Age events, the details of the war and the Trojan fall remain an enigma. Connections between Mycenaeans and Trojans can also be traced in the artifacts found in archaeological sites. For example, in Troy Mycenical objects have been found, such as ceramics and jewels, indicating that there was a cultural and commercial exchange between both civilizations. However, there is also evidence of tensions between the two groups, which suggests that the Myclenics not only had peaceful relationships with Troy, but they could also have had military reasons to get into conflict. The role of the Mycenaics in the Trojan War is not limited only to the warriors who fought in the front, such as Achilles and Agamemnon. Mycenaean culture is also reflected in the organization of the war itself. The Achaeans who marched to Troy were a highly structured military force, probably organized around a warrior elite that directed the armies and a series of lower-range soldiers. The alliance system, the oaths of loyalty and the pacts, such as the one that unites the main Achaean kings under the authority of Agamemnon, also have parallels with the way in which the Mycenaeans structured their own political relations. In addition, the Trojan War was not only a matter of political and economic power, but also of honor. The Mycenaean deeply valued the concept of time, or honor, and this principle is reflected in the way the war was fought, where the heroes fought not only for the loot or the territory, but for the personal glory. The clearest example of this is Achilles, whose anger and pride become the engines of much of the Iliad. The conflict was not only a military struggle, but a struggle for reputation and fame that would last forever. It is important to note that the Mycenaean were not only warriors. Archaeological evidence also shows that they were artisan experts, merchants and builders. Their weapons, such as swords and spears, were of exceptional quality, and their homes, palaces and tombs were large and decorated with fresh intricate and reliefs. The Mycenaean created a rich artistic and cultural tradition that left a lasting footprint in later Greek art. In the end, the Mycenaean civilization was a victim of the same violence that marked the Trojan War. Towards the end of the 12th century BC, the big Mycenaean cities began to decline, probably due to a combination of foreign invasions, internal tensions, and natural disasters. The fall of Mycenae marked the end of an era and the beginning of what is known as the Dark Age of Greece. Although the exact connection between the Mycenaean and the Trojan War remains uncertain, its legacy endures both the mythical stories and in the archaeological tests that have survived to this day. The history of those, with their heroes and villains, reminds us that, beyond war and destruction, cultures and civilizations continue to leave a deep mark on the collective memory of humanity. Greek myths were born in a distant time, in a world where gods and humans shared the same earth, although separated by the mortality gap. In that world, myths were not just stories of heroes and monsters, they were the explanations for the mysteries of life, the universe, and humanity. Each myth was an answer to deep questions. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? How should we live? The myths not only entertained, but also taught fundamental lessons about human nature and the cosmic forces that governed the fate of men. From the most remote origins of Greek civilization, myths were a direct reflection of the beliefs and values of society. They not only described the exploits of gods and heroes, but also established the principles that should guide human beings. Each mythological story was impregnated with symbolism and morality, offering a guide on how to live in a world full of uncertainty. In the early days, the Greeks believed that the universe was governed by a divine order, an invisible force that defined the destiny of men. This order was represented through the gods of Olympus, powerful beings who personified aspects of nature and the human condition. Zeus, the king of the gods, was in charge of maintaining balance, but even he could not escape the whims of destiny. Greek myths showed that, although the gods could intervene in human affairs, they were not infallible, and as mortals, they were also subject to passions, jealousy, and errors. This divine imperfection reflected the complexity of life itself. Fate was not something that could be controlled, and life was full of challenges, struggles, and sacrifices. One of the most important values that the Greek myths transmitted was the arete, excellence or virtue. The mythological heroes, such as Achilles, Heracles, or Ulysses, were not only known by their strength or skills, but for their ability to face challenges that tested their honor, their courage, and their humanity. The heroes represented the ideal of what the Greeks aspired to be, individuals capable of achieving great feats, but also aware of their limitations and vulnerabilities. The search for the arete was a constant search, an internal struggle to achieve perfection, although never completely attainable. However, myths also warned about the dangers of hybris, arrogance, or excess of the gods. Many heroes fell into the trap of challenging divine laws, believing that they could escape destiny or challenge the will of the gods. The myth of Icaro, for example, shows the tragic consequences of trying to fly too close to the sun, challenging the borders imposed by nature. In many myths, hybris as punishment was severe. Fatality fell on those who believed themselves above the gods, demonstrating that, although humans could reach great achievements, they should never forget their place in the cosmic order. Myths also reflected the importance of family and home in Greek society. The gods and heroes were involved in complex family relationships, with parents, children, and brothers playing essential roles in the plots. The myths about the family, such as that of the House of Atreo or the destiny of the descendants of the curse of Oedipus, were representations of how past decisions could mark the fate of future generations. This cyclical vision of destiny, where the actions of a generation inevitably influence the following, spoke of the importance of moral decisions and longer-term consequences. The role of women in Greek myths also offers a reflection on the beliefs and values of the time. The female figures in myths, such as Athena, Artemis, Hera, and Aphrodite, represented both the divine power and the complexities of femininity. However, often women in myths were portrayed in traditional roles, such as wives, mothers, or lovers, although some female figures, such as Artemis, could challenge these expectations. The stories of women such as Medea, Penelope, or Helena reflect the tensions between female autonomy and roles imposed by society. These figures were seen, on the one hand, as powerful and, on the other, as responsible for the catastrophe or the salvation of men, which reveals the ambiguous way in which the Greek culture saw women. On the other hand, myths also serve to explain natural and cosmic phenomena. The creation of the world, the separation of the earth and the sea station amber, and the appearance of astronomical phenomena were explained through mythological stories that tried to put in words what humans could not understand for themselves. The story of Demeter and Persephone, which explains the origin of the stations, or the myth of Apollo and Dionysius, which personify the forces of light and darkness, were attempts to give meaning to the natural cycle of life. The gods not only ruled the fate of humans, but also the cosmic order, where the stations changed, the heavens darkened and life flourished according to their will. In addition, myths also reflected the social and political conflicts of ancient Greece. The struggles between gods and titans, or the clashes between heroes and monsters, were not only adventure stories, but also representations of internal tensions within society itself. The Trojan War, as an example, could be seen as a symbol of conflicts between the different Greek states, each looking for their own power and glory. Although in the myths, the gods were often involved in these conflicts, they also served as metaphors of the human fighters themselves who defended their honor and rights. In summary, the Greek myths were not only fantastic narratives, but also reflected the beliefs and values of a civilization. Through these stories, the Greeks not only tried to understand the world that surrounded them, but also found a means to convey their ideals, warnings, and moral lessons. Each myth, with its heroes and villains, its tragedies and triumphs, was a powerful tool to teach generations to come about what it meant to be human, live in harmony with the gods, and face the inevitable fight against fate. In Greek mythology, the gods are not only powerful beings that inhabit Olympus, they are reflexes of the forces of nature, human emotions, and the values that define society. Through their interventions in mythological stories, especially in the stories about the Trojan War, the gods play a fundamental role, not only as actors within the plot, but also as symbols that embody dilemmas, conflicts, and lessons that humanity must learn. In this context, the gods are not only immortal and majestic, they are imperfect, vindictive, jealous, and sometimes even capricious, reflecting the complex nature of human passions. In Homer's Iliad, the Trojan War is not only a conflict between two peoples, the Greeks and the Trojans, but also a battlefield in which the gods align with one side or another, driven by their own emotions, rivalries, and desires. These gods are not limited to observing from afar, but actively intervene in the mortal struggles, influencing the decisions of the heroes, in the result of the battles, and in the destiny of the characters. Each divine intervention is loaded with symbolism, since it reflects broader aspects of human behavior, morality, and universal laws. Zeus, the king of the gods, is the symbol of cosmic order and justice, but also of the inevitability of destiny. Although he tries to maintain an impartial balance in war, his decisions are deeply influenced by his own feelings and personal debts. When Zeus decides not to intervene directly in the struggle between the Greeks and the Trojans, it is shown as a symbol of the cosmic law that seeks balance, but also of the fatality that governs both gods and mortals. Despite his supreme power, Zeus is aware that there are forces greater than him, the fate and will of the universe, which dictate the course of events. Their role in the Trojan War reflects the idea that, although the gods have immense power, they cannot alter destiny absolutely. The war itself is a reflection of the fight against the inevitable, a struggle in which, despite divine interventions, death and sacrifice are imminent. Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, is the symbol of protection and heat. His intervention in the war has a strong personal component, since he is motivated by his rivalry with the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Hera supports the Greeks, not only for his desire to ensure the power of his divine family, but for the desire to take revenge on Aphrodite's affronts. This intervention illustrates how human passions, such as love, jealousy, and revenge, have a divine reflection. Hera acts moved by a deeply human emotional force, which directly influences the destiny of mortals. In it, Greek mythology shows how intense emotions can unleash conflicts, both in the divine and human world. Aphrodite, by other side, is the symbol of beauty, love and desire, but also of manipulation and disappointment. Through his speech at the Trojan War, Aphrodite not only represents the power of love, but also how desires and passions can affect the course of events. She, like Hera, is not limited to influencing mortals indirectly, but acts directly, manipulating the heroes and pushing them towards decisions that often have tragic consequences. His support for Paris, the Trojan prince who causes war by taking Helena, symbolizes how love and excessive desire can trigger catastrophes. The gods, like humans, are vulnerable to their own desires and passions, demonstrating the unpredictable and dangerous nature of human emotion. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, plays a crucial role in the war, especially as protector of the Greeks. Athena is the symbol of intelligence, reason, and justice, but also of cunning and strategy. His support for the Greeks in the Trojan War reflects the importance of strategy and war planning. Through Athena, the Greeks learned that brute force is not always enough to win, and that wisdom and cunning are equally important. Athena is also the goddess who intervenes in decisive moments to guide the heroes, as Odysseus, who through her cunning achieves great victories, such as the famous wooden horse trick. The goddess represents the rational and calculator of war, one that values the mind as much as the muscle. His intervention also highlights the duality of war, where both violence and intelligence play fundamental roles. Apollo, the god of light, music and prophecy, is another divine figure that plays a significant role in the Trojan War. Apollo is often the symbol of truth, but also of destruction and death. In the Iliad, Apollo is the god who helps the Trojans in their battles, but is also responsible for many of the deaths of the Greek heroes. Apollo shows the dual nature of the gods. They can bring light and hope, but they can also immerse the world in darkness and suffering. Apollo is a god who, like many others in Greek mythology, acts not only based on justice, but also of revenge and anger, reflecting how divine decisions are intrinsically linked to human emotions. Finally, Ares, the god of war, symbolizes brutality, violence, and chaos inherent in any conflict. Unlike Athena, which represents the strategic war, Ares is associated with the disorderly and bloody war, the fight without reason or purpose. Ours is shown as an impulsive and destructive god who does not take into account the suffering he causes. His presence in the Trojan War highlights the darkest and wildest side of war, the one that is not governed by rules or honor, but by pure violence. Together, the Greek gods in mythology represent the different aspects of war and human nature. From the power of love and desire, to wisdom, revenge, violence and brutality, every god is a symbol of a primary force that influences the destiny of mortals. Through their interventions, the gods not only shape the course of the Trojan War, but also teach human lessons on their own limits, passions, and the inevitability of destiny. The Greek gods, with their virtues and defects, are a mirror of humanity itself, reflecting their deepest desires, fears, and contradictions. The Iliad is not just an epic over the heroes of the Trojan War, it is a work that has centuries of tradition, legends, and stories transmitted orally from generation to generation. Before Homer embodied the exploits of Achilles, Hector, and the gods in written words, the history of Troy and its protagonists was in the collective imaginary of the Greek peoples, told around bonfires, in banquets and festivities, by itinerant poets known like rhapsodes. The Iliad, as we know it today, is the result of a long process of oral evolution and its subsequent crystallization in a literary form that managed to transcend time. Oral transmission in ancient Greece was the most common way to preserve and share stories. Since time immemorial, the stories of the gods, heroes, and battles were verbally transmitted, often with a rhythmic structure that facilitated memorization. These stories were not fixed, they varied according to the narrator, the region, or the context in which they were counted. The oral poets, such as those known in the Homeric tradition, not only repeated a specific version of the myths, but often adapted and enriched them, adding new evos elements, characters, or approaches, according to the needs of your audience. Homer, the legendary poet who is mainly associated with the creation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, was probably not the only one to tell these stories, but it was the one who consolidated them in a definitive and coherent way. It is believed that he lived in the 7th century BC, although its exact existence remains a mystery, as is the exact process through which the Iliad went from being an oral story to a written literary work. Although Homer is attributed to the creation of the Iliad, the reality is that it is likely that what he did was organize and unify the scattered stories that circulated in oral tradition, giving them a coherent structure and a literary style that would last throughout the centuries. The nature of the oral transmission of these stories had certain characteristics that would influence the way Homer wrote the Iliad. Epic poetry, as practiced in Greece, was full of formulas, epithets, and repetitive structures that helped the poet remember and adjust the rhythm of the narration while telling it. Phrases like Achilles, the light feet, or Hector, the spear are examples of common epithets that helped the rhapsodes to fill the time and maintain the rhythm of the story. This approach is due, in part, to how the stories were transmitted in the oral field. The narrators did not necessarily follow a precise temporal line, but based on the narration at key moments or significant episodes. The Iliad not only counts the Trojan War, but the structure of the work itself reflects the flexible and adaptive forms of the oral story. The addition of divine intervention is another characteristic that dates back to oral tradition. In the oral versions of the myths, the gods were active characters that not only observed the events, but directly influenced the destiny of mortals. In the Iliad, the gods are not abstract or distant figures, they are beings that actively participate in battles, intervening decisively in conflicts between heroes. This interaction between the gods and men reflects the understanding of the ancient Greeks that human destiny was intertwined with forces beyond its control, a belief deeply rooted in orality, where divine intervention was a recurring theme. The change from oral tradition to literary also implied a transformation in the style and way of telling the story. At the time of writing the stories, Homer, and the poets who came after him, faced the challenge of making the narratives understandable and attractive in a written medium, in which the rhythm and musicality of oral language could not be perceived in the same way. Despite this, epic poetry continued to use oral techniques, such as repetition, parallelism, and symmetry, to give the work a narrative flow and a cadence of oral tradition. The Iliad is also the reflection of a cultural change. At the time Homer wrote his work, Greece was going from being a society based on orality to a literary society, in which writing began to have a greater relevance. Thus, the Iliad becomes not only a product of the oral tradition, but also a symbol of the transition between two worlds, the world of living memory, transmitted by voice, and the world of writing, which sets for always stories on paper. The Iliad, as a literary product, adapts and transforms over time. The myths and stories that Homer collected from the oral tradition were interpreted, rewritten, and reconfigured by poets and authors from different eras, from the tragic of ancient Greece to modern writers. Each new version of the Trojan War was a reflection of the cultural, political, and social context of its time, but always maintained the core of the stories that Homer had collected from the oral tradition. This ability to adapt the Iliad demonstrates the powerful resonance of stories, which continue to touch the deepest fibers of humanity, even today. Thus, the Iliad not only represents a literary work, but also a testimony of the process of adaptation and evolution of the narrative over time. Of the first epic song ca Tarsiers in the squares of ancient Greece, until the written version we know today, the Iliad remains one of the most powerful stories that have ever told each other, a story that continues to speak to human beings of all times about the war, honor, love, and death. In the Iliad, the characters are not clearly divided into good and bad, heroes and villains. Homer, in his genius, presents us with a deeply complex human mosaic, where the protagonists embody both virtues and defects. This realistic and multifaceted approach allows heroes and anti-heroes of the epic transcend time, resonating in the heart of those who read or listen to their history. Each figure, from Achilles to Hector, from Paris to Agamemnon, reveals facets of the human condition that are still familiar to us today. Achilles, the hero par excellence, is the epitome of force, courage, and glory. But under his bronze armor and his skill on the battlefield, beats a heart marked by anger and pride. His anger, unleashed by Agamemnon's breakdown by snatching Bresaida, leads him to withdraw from war, condemning his own to suffering. In his pain and fury, Achilles is able to commit acts of extreme cruelty, such as the desecration of Hector's body. However, it also shows a capacity for redemption and humanity in the end, when it agrees to return the body of its enemy to Priam, in a scene full of emotion and reconciliation. Achilles is not simply a hero, he is a man trapped in his passions, his fears, and his destiny. Hector, on the other hand, is Troy's moral pillar. As prince and leader, he assumes the responsibility of protecting his people, even when he knows that Troy's fate is sealed. His bravery does not lie only in his ability with weapons, but in his deep sense of duty. Hector fights not for personal glory, but for his family and his city. However, he is also human. He fears the defeat, is debated between his duty and his desire to remain with Andromache and his son, and makes mistakes that lead him to his tragic end. Hector represents a type of heroism that is based on sacrifice and love, in contrast to the search for individual Achilles' glory. Paris, the cause of the war, is presented as Hector's opposite. Although physically attractive and favored by Aphrodite, its character is marked by cowardice and selfishness. Paris prefers pleasure and comfort before facing the consequences of their actions. His abduction from Helena is the trigger for a tragedy that consumes thousands, but he avoids the responsibilities that this implies. Despite this, his love for Helena is not entirely vile. Although superficial, there is a spark of devotion that sometimes redeems it of its frivolity. Agamemnon, the king of kings, is another ambiguous character. As leader of the Greeks, their ambition and arrogance are evident. His dispute with Achilles endangers the Greek cause, and his decision to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to obtain favorable winds, shows it as a man willing to sacrifice the most precious in the name of his duty. However, behind his authority, a man who loads with the weight of war and difficult decisions is glimpsed, a leader who cannot afford to show weakness. Ulysses, or Odysseus, brings a different perspective to the concept of heroism. His cunning and ability to solve problems make him an essential pillar for the Greeks. He is not the strongest or the most imposing, but his sharp mind compensates for any lack of physical power. However, his pragmatism often leads him to act in a questionable way, as in the case of the Trojan horse, where the strategy implies deception and betrayal. Ulysses is not a traditional hero, he is a man who uses his ingenuity to navigate in a chaotic world, which makes him a fascinating and deeply human character. Diomedes and Ajax are other examples of heroes whose moral relevance varies. Diomedes is brave and bold, but also reckless, getting to challenge the gods themselves in their rage. Ajax, on the other hand, represents brute force and loyalty, but his inability to accept defeat in the dispute over Achilles' weapons leads him to madness and suicide. These characters embody both heroic and tragic aspects, expanding the spectrum of what it means to be a hero. Among the female figures, Helena occupies a central place as an anti-hero that is not completely guilty of her destiny, but is not innocent either. Its beauty is both a gift and a curse, and its ambivalence towards the war that has caused adds depth to its character. Andromache and Hecuba, on the other hand, personify the silent heroism of suffering and resilience. Both support unimaginable losses with a dignity that transcends circumstances. Even the gods, which could be considered higher and morally impeccable beings, participate in the conflict with their own agendas and defects. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, and others act moved by human emotions, jealousy, favoritisms, revenge, and whims. His interventions in war reflect not only their power, but also their vulnerability to the passions they share with mortals. The moral relevance of the heroes and anti-heroes in the Iliad lies in their complexity. Homer does not offer simple answers or categorical judgments about his characters. Instead, it shows us a world where heroism is as ambiguous and multifaceted as human nature itself. The heroes are capable of acts of great nobility, but also of devastating errors. Anti-heroes, on the other hand, often reveal flashes of humanity that make them difficult to condemn completely. Iliad forces us to face the fragility of our own notions of good and bad, honor and dishonor, courage and cowardice. In their characters, we see our own dilemmas, our strengths and our weaknesses reflected. It is this complexity, this ability to capture humanity in all its forms, which makes the illiterate an immortal work, and its heroes and anti-heroes in eternally living figures in our memory. War, since time immemorial, has been a constant in the history of mankind. In the Iliad, Homer presents the Trojan War not only as an epic conflict between heroes, but as a deeply human experience that leaves indelible traces in those who live it. Beyond the clash of weapons and glory on the battlefield, war reveals the passions, miseries, and hopes of men and women who are trapped in their maelstrom. When reflecting on this epic, it is not difficult to find parallels with the impact of war on ancient and modern civilization, and how this universal phenomenon has molded both history and human psyche. In the Iliad, the war is presented as a devastating force that consumes everything in its path. The heroes seek eternal glory, Kleos, but that search has a terrible cost. War destroys homes, separates families, and sows immeasurable pain. Troy, a majestic city, symbol of civilization and pride, is reduced to ashes. The faces of its inhabitants, from Hector to Andromache, reflect the tragedy of those who see how their world falls apart before their eyes. This representation of the war is not limited to the past. In each era, the cities devastated by the war have been a reminder of its brutality, from the ruins of Carthage to the bombed streets of Dresde, Hiroshima, or Aleppo. However, war also shows the contradictions of humanity. On the one hand, it awakens the worst in us, violence, cruelty, and hate. On the other, it brings to light acts of heroism, sacrifice, and solidarity that reveal the human capacity to resist even in the most adverse circumstances. In the Iliad, Achilles and Hector represent these two faces. Achilles, in his anger, commits atrocities, but is also redeemed by recognizing Priam's pain. Hector, in his courage, faces an inevitable destiny, motivated by his love to his family and his duty to Troy. These dualities reflect how war, although tragic, can be a mirror that forces us to confront who we are really. The Iliad also shows how war affects not only combatants, but a whole society. The women of Troy, such as Andromache and Hecuba, personify the suffering of those who lose their loved ones and see their lives destroyed by decisions they never made. This echo resonates throughout history. In modern wars, from the trenches of the First World War to current conflicts, women and children have supported the weight of displacement, poverty, and trauma. War does not discriminate, its impact reaches everyone, regardless of their position on the battlefield. In the old context, the war was also an engine of change. Civilizations grew and fell due to conflicts. War promoted technological and organizational advances, such as weapons improvement, military strategy, and logistics administration. However, these conquests were accompanied by irreparable human and cultural losses. The destruction of Troy, although legendary, can be seen as a reflection of the disappearance of entire cultures in real conflicts of antiquity. In the modern era, the war has acquired an even more devastating scale and impact. Industrialization and technological advances have led to global conflicts such as the two world wars, where millions of lives were lost in the name of economic ideologies, territories, and powers. The war, which in antiquity was fought with swords and spears, has been transformed in a phenomenon in which nuclear weapons, drones, and cyber attacks redefine the battlefield. However, the essence of war remains the same: the struggle for power and resources, and the inability of humanity to solve its differences peacefully. One of the deepest reflections that emerges from the Iliad is the futility of war. Despite sacrifices and victories, human cost always exceeds any gain. Homer does not glorify war, rather, it shows its consequences in a stark way. Hector, the most noble hero of Troy, dies in an unequal confrontation. Troy, despite all its resistance, falls. The victors, although triumphant, are marked by suffering and losses. This lesson remains relevant today, where armed conflicts, even those considered victorious, leave the nations facing decades of reconstruction, division, and social scars. At the same time, war has molded the art, literature, and collective memory of humanity. Works such as Iliad are a testimony of how human beings have tried to make sense of war, to capture its impact and learn from it. The stories of the Greek heroes not only narrate a distant war, but also invite us to reflect on our own struggles and contradictions. In modern art, from the poetry of Wilfred Owen in World War I to Kurt Vonnegut's novels about the Second, the artists have continued to explore the same questions that Homer posed: why do we fight? What do we really win? What do we lose in the process? Ultimately, war is both a reminder of our weaknesses and an opportunity to reflect on our ability to change. The Iliad, with its mixture of glory and tragedy, leaves us with the feeling that humanity can be better if it only learned from the mistakes of the past. But as Troy, history shows us that learning does not always arrive on time. In the Iliad, the Trojan War is not just a scenario of blood, honor, and glory, it is also the framework where human ties tense and break, where love and sacrifice are intertwined in heartbreaking ways. Helena, Andromache, and Bresaida are three women whose stories show that, behind each battle, there is a universe of emotions that transcend the field of war. Their experiences remind us that, although men raise swords, they are the hearts of those who love those who load the deepest wounds. Helena, the most beautiful woman in the world, is perhaps the most controversial figure in this story. Straight from Sparta by Paris, her beauty is the trigger for the tragedy, but her role is far from being simple. Helena is not just an award, a duel disputed between men. In it the guilt, repentance, and yearning live together. While observing from the walls of Troy the suffering that his love has caused, Helena wonders if her beauty has been a blessing or a curse. Is it guilty for following Paris, for succumbing to Aphrodite's promise? Or is he a victim of a destination that he could never control? This dilemma makes it a deeply human figure, trapped between desire and remorse. His love in Paris, although intense, does not pound the weight of the sacrifice. Every life lost in battle reminds him that his choice was not only his, but of all those who now suffer for her. Andromache, meanwhile, is the soul of Troy, the heart that beats for a future that wobbles. His love for Hector is the essence of his strength, but also his greatest vulnerability. At every moment shared with her husband, Andromache knows that Troy's fate depends on him, and that the same destiny will condemn him. The scene in which he begs Hector not to return to the battlefield, knowing that it will be the last time he sees him, is one of the most moving in the Iliad. His love does not seek glory or recognition, it is a love that fears, that protects, that clings to what you know you can't keep. When Hector falls, Andromache loses not only a husband, but also the stability of his world. His sacrifice does not end with his duel. As a war prisoner, he loads with humiliation and loss, but never with the defeat of his spirit. Bresaida, finally, is the silenced voice amid a conflict dominated by men. Captured as war loot, her life is defined by decisions that others make for her. However, even in adversity, Bresaida emerges as a symbol of emotional resistance. His link with Achilles, although born in a context of violence and oppression, reveals a connection that transcends the circumstances. When Achilles loses Bresaida by the dispute with Agamemnon, his anger not only reflects the injured pride of a warrior, but also the pain of a relationship torn from his hands. Bresaida, in their silent dignity, reminds us that even in the war, the ties of affection can flourish, even if they are often sentenced to wither. The sacrifice, in these three women, adopts different forms but equally heartbreaking. Helena sacrifices her honor and inner peace for a love that becomes an unbearable burden. Andromache delivers her personal happiness for her husband's duty and her love for Troy, facing devastation with unwavering force. Bresaida, deprived of his freedom, finds in his pain a form of resistance that defies the expectations of his time. Together, their stories draw an emotional map of what it means to love in times of war, when each caress can be the last, when each promise is dyed by uncertainty. War not only consumes cities and armies, it also devours the hearts of those who dare to love in the midst of destruction. The sacrifices of Helena, Andromache, and Bresaida are a reminder that, although the war can define the heroes on the battlefield, it is the sacrifices in the name of love that show us the true courage. And so, while Troy's walls collapse, the stories of these women rise, enduring as a testimony of human resilience against the most cruel adversity. The Iliad, composed more than 2,500 years ago, continues to beating with a force that transcends time. This epic poem, attributed to Homer, has not only survived the centuries, but has been intertwined with the modern literature, art, and culture in surprising ways. Its relevance is not only in its heroic or mythological content, but in the essential questions it raises about the human condition, glory, love, loss, and inexorable fight against destiny. It is this emotional and philosophical depth that makes the illiterate an immortal myth. In modern literature, the Iliad has become an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Writers such as James Joyce, with his work Ulysses, or Madeline Miller, with the Achilles song, have reinterpreted Homer's stories, exploring the most intimate and human aspects of epic characters. They are not simple rewriting, they are dialogues with the past, a literary conversation that updates the issues of the Iliad for contemporary audiences. Through these works, Achilles, Hector, and Helena are not distant figures, but characters that feel and suffer like any modern person. The Trojan War ceases to be a mythological event and becomes a mirror in which we see our own conflicts and dilemmas reflected. In cinema and television, the Iliad has found new forms of visual narration. Films such as Troy, 2004, and series like Troy, Fall of a City bring the myth to new generations, using modern technology to recreate the epic of the fighting and emotions of its protagonists. Although these adaptations often take freedoms with the original story, they manage to capture the essence of the Iliad, the intensity of human ties in the midst of war. Beyond loyalty to text, these representations show how the Trojan War remains a living story, capable of resonating at any time. The impact of the Iliad also extends to philosophy and ethical reflection. His exploration of issues such as Achilles' wrath, Hector's courage, and Priam's suffering when losing his son poses questions about the honor, forgiveness, and the purpose of life. Philosophers such as Simone Weil have analyzed the poem as a work that, rather than glorifying war, exposes its brutality and futility. In a world marked by constant conflicts, the Iliad invites us to reconsider what human being against violence and chaos means. In popular culture, myth has permeated beyond the confines of classical art. Video games, such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, have incorporated elements of Greek mythology, presenting the heroes and gods of Troy in interactive and accessible contexts for younger audiences. Fashion, music, and graphic design have also drunk with the aesthetics and symbols of the Iliad, demonstrating that its influence has no limits. Each reinterpretation, however modern, preserves the emotional and narrative core that makes Homer's work a pillar of human imagination. But why is the Iliad remains relevant? The answer is in your universality. The Trojan War, with its heroes and tragedies, could be placed anywhere and time. Achilles' anger is not different from the emotions that we have all felt at some point: the pain of betrayal, the desire for revenge, the search for purpose in the middle of chaos. Hector, when facing his destiny, embodies the eternal conflict between duty and fear. Helena, trapped between two worlds, reflects the internal struggle between desire and either regret. These dilemmas transcend their original context and resonate in each reader, spectator, or creator who approaches the myth. In addition, the Iliad reminds us of the power of oral and written narrative to immortalize collective memory. Before being written, it was sung by generations of rhapsoders that preserved their verses in the living memory of the peoples. In a world where everything seems to be ephemeral, the Iliad demonstrates how a story can resist time and remain relevant, precisely because it addresses what never changes, the complexity of the human soul. Today, in an era of technological advances and globalization, the Iliad connects us with our roots. It reminds us that, even if the world changes, essential questions remain. What does it mean to be a hero? What value has life in the midst of death? How do we face suffering and sacrifice? Homer's work does not offer definitive answers, but he invites us to reflect, to feel, to remember that, behind mythology, there is humanity itself. Thus, the immortality of the myth does not only reside in its age or in its greatness, but in its ability to adapt, to revive in each era with new forms and meanings. The Iliad is a bridge between the old and the modern, an invisible thread that unites generations and cultures, reminding us that the stories, when they are true, never die. The echo of Troy resonates as an eternal whisper in the soul of humanity, a melody composed of glory and tragedy, victories and defeats that transcend the battlefield. Trojan's War is not only a story of heroes and gods, but a symbol that is deeply rooted in what it means to be human. Each confrontation, each sacrifice, every tear shed under the burning sky of Troy, is a reminder that greatness and devastation usually walk hand. In the glory of the heroes, the Trojan War finds its brightest side. Hector, Achilles, Ajax, and Ulysses not only fought for victory, they fought for a place in eternity. For them, death was not the end, but a door towards immortality, a passage where brave acts were recorded in songs and stories. However, that search for glory is always accompanied by a price, the most beloved sacrifice, goodbye to the family, the confrontation with pain and loss. Is this the inevitable cost of greatness? Trojan's tragedy lies in the fragility of his dreams. The beauty of Helena, the courage of Hector, the cunning of Ulysses, and the strength of Achilles are flashes of humanity that shine in a world marked by chaos. However, all these flashes are destined to go out, victims of a struggle that, in the end, seems as useless as it is inevitable. Troy falls not only as a city, but as a symbol of the ephemeral of human existence. Its walls, which seemed invincible, yield to ingenuity and betrayal, reminding us that even the most solid can crumble before the inexorable passage of time. But Troy's greatness does not only reside in his heroes or his tragedies, but in his ability to transcend time. His echo is still alive, narrated again and again, as if the act of telling his story was a collective attempt to preserve something bigger than ourselves. In that echo, Troy is not just a lost city, it is an idea, a warning, a dream, and a lesson. It is humanity fighting itself, looking for meaning in the midst of chaos, trying to find beauty in destruction. Trojan's glory and tragedy are not opposite, they are two faces of the same currency. Each triumph carries with it a shadow, and each loss leaves a mark that becomes memory. This balance between the sublime and the painful is what keeps the myth alive, which makes it resonate in each generation, which makes the echo of Troy never go out. In its fall, Troy rises as an eternal symbol, a reminder of what we are able to build and destroy. Thus, while Troy walls fall again and again in the imagination of those who listen to their history, their spirit lasts, immortal. His echo continues to call us, not as a cry of war, but as a whisper that invites us to reflect on our own search for glory, our own tragedies, and the legacy we leave behind us. Troy lives, not in its ruins, but in the hearts of those who find in their history a reflection of the eternal.